Chapter 35 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux. Chapter 35, in which there is another mystery. The girl puzzled him. Her attitude was as though she delighted in tantalizing him, as if she held knowledge superior to his own. And so she did. She was evidently aware of the whereabouts of Maud, his own lost love. He repeated his question, his eyes fixed upon a pale, serious countenance, but she made no response. "Why have you brought me here, Miss Lorena?" he asked. "You told me you had something to tell me." "So I have," she answered, looking up at him again. "I don't know, Mr. Rolfe, what opinion you must have of me, but I hope you will consider my self-introduction permissible under the circumstances." "Why, of course," he declared. For truth to tell, he was much interested in her. She seemed so charmingly unconventional, not much more than a schoolgirl, and yet with all the delightful sweetness of budding womanhood. "But you have mentioned the name of a woman who is lost to me." "Ah, Maud Petrovich," she sighed. "Yes, I know all the tragic story." "The tragic story?" he echoed, staring at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean the tragic story of your love," was her slow, distinct reply. "Pray forgive me, Mr. Rolfe, for mentioning a subject which must be most painful, but I have only done so to show you that I am aware of the secret of your affection." "Then you are a friend of Maud?" She nodded without uttering a word. "Where is she? I must see her," he said quickly, with a fierce, anxious look upon his countenance. "This suspense is killing me." She was silent. Slowly she turned her fine eyes upon his, looking straight into his face. "You ought surely to know," she said unflinchingly. I know? Why? Why do you say that?" "Because you know the truth. You know why they so suddenly disappeared." "I know the truth?" he repeated. "Indeed, I do not. You are speaking in enigmas, just as you yourself are an enigma, Miss Lorena." Her lips relaxed into a smile of incredulity. "Why, Mr. Rolfe, do you make a pretence of ignorance, when you are fully aware of the whole of the combination of circumstances which led Dr. Petrovich and his daughter to escape from London?" "But, my dear girl," he cried, "you entirely misjudge me. I am in complete ignorance." "And yet you were present at Cromwell Road on the night in question," she said slowly, fixing her eyes calmly upon him. "Who are you, Miss Lorena, that you should make these direct allegations against me?" he cried, staring at her. "I am your friend, Mr. Rolfe, if you will allow me to act as such." "My friend!" he cried. "But you are alleging that I have secret knowledge of the doctor's disappearance, that I make a pretence of ignorance. If I were in possession of the facts, is it feasible that I should be so anxious of the welfare of Maud?" "No anxiety is needed." "Then she is alive?" "I believe so." "And well?" "Yes, she is quite well. But what?" he demanded. "Speak, Lorena, speak, I beg of you." She had hesitated, and he saw by her contracted brow that anxiety had arisen within her mind. "Well, she is safe, I believe, up to the present. Yet, if what I fear be true, she is daily, nay, hourly in peril, in deadliest peril." "Peril?" he gasped. "Of what?" "Of her life. You know that the political organizations of the East are fraught with murder plots. Dr. Petrovich has opponents, fierce, dastardly opponents, who would hesitate at nothing to encompass his end. They have intrigued to induce the king to place him in disgrace, but at Belgrade the Petrovich party are still predominant. It's only in the country, at Niš and Pirat, where the opposition is really strong. You seem to know Serbia and the complications of Serbian politics, mademoiselle?" he remarked. "Yes, I happen to know something of them. I made them a study, and I assure you it would be very fascinating if there were not quite so many imprisonments in the awful fortress of Belgrade, and secret assassination. But Serbia is a young country," the girl added with philosophic air, "and all young countries must go through the same periods of unrest and internal trouble. At any rate, all parties in Serbia acknowledge that King Peter is a constitutional monarch, and is doing his utmost for the benefit of his people." "You are a partisan of the Karageorgievich?" "I am. I make no secret of it. Alexander and Draga were mere puppets in the hands of Serbia's enemies. Under King Peter the country is once more prosperous, and after all, political life there is no more fraught with danger than it is in go-ahead Bulgaria. Did they not kill poor Petkov the other day in the Boris garden in Sofia? That was a more cruel and dastardly murder than any in Serbia, for Petkov had only one arm and was unable to defend himself. The other was shot away at the Shipka, where he fought for his country against the Turk. How is it you know so much of Serbia? Charlie inquired, for he found himself listening to the girl's sound arguments with much interest. Her views upon the complicated situation in the Near East were almost identical with his. Did you ever see Petkov, for instance? I knew him well. Twice I've dined at his house in Sofia. Strangely enough, he was with his bosom friend Stambulov when the latter was assassinated, and for years was a marked man. As Prince Ferdinand's prime minister, which he was at the time he was shot, he introduced many reforms into Bulgaria and was a patriot to the core. He was surprised. Who could this girl be who dined with prime ministers and who was apparently behind the scenes of Balkan politics? And you fear lest the same fate should befall Maud? Why? He asked. Because the opposition has a motive, a strong motive, for the secret assassination of the daughter of the man who has made Serbia what she is, he exclaimed. Yes, Maud is in peril, and for that reason, I suppose, is living incognito? Possibly, she answered, not without hesitation. There is, I believe, a second reason. What is that? I scarcely like to tell you, Mr. Rolfe. We are strangers, you and I. But do tell me, I am very anxious to know. If she is your friend, she has no doubt told you of her love. Well, she wishes to avoid you. Avoid me? Why? Because acquaintance with you increases her peril. How absurd, he cried. How can a love for me affect a father's political opponents in Serbia? I am ignorant of the reasons. I only know the broad facts. But the doctor had retired from active political life long ago. He told me one day how tired he was of the eternal bickerings of the Skupshina. Of course, he had ostensibly retired, but he secretly directed the policy of the present government. In all serious matters, King Peter still consults him. And that is why you have brought me to the privacy of these gardens, Miss Lorena, to tell me this? He laughed, bending to her and drawing a semicircle in the gravel with the point of his stick. No, she replied sharply with just a little frown of displeasure. You do not understand me, Mr. Rolfe. Have I not said a few moments ago that I wanted to be your friend? You are a most delightful little friend, was his courteous reply. Ah, I see. You treat me as a child, was her rather impatient reply. You're not serious. I'm most serious, he declared with a solemn face. Indeed, I was never more serious in my life than I am at this moment. She burst out laughing, a peal of light, merry, irresponsible, girlish laughter. And before I met you, she said, I thought you a most terribly austere person. So I am at times. I have to be, Miss Lorena. I am secretary to a very serious old gentleman, remember? Yes. And that was the reason why I threw the convenances to the winds, if there are any in the Anglo-French circle in Paris, and spoke to you, a perfect stranger. You spoke because I was Mr. Statham's secretary? He asked, somewhat puzzled. Yes, I wanted to speak to you privately. Well, nobody can overhear us here, he said, glancing around and noticing only a fat bonne wheeling a puny child in a gaudily trapped perambulator. I wanted to speak to you regarding Mr. Statham, she said after a long pause. I ascertained you were coming to Paris and waited in order to see you. Why? He asked, much surprised. The refusal of her name, her determination to conceal her identity, her friendship for Maud, and her intimate acquaintance with everything Serbian all combined to puzzle him to the verge of distraction. Who was she? What was she? The mystery of the doctor and his daughter was an increasing one. His pretended ignorance of certain facts had been unmasked by her in a manner which showed that she was aware of the actual truth. Was she really a secret messenger from the girl he loved so devotedly? The girl with whom he had last walked and talked with in the quietness of the London Sandown in Nevern Square? He glanced again at a pretty but mysterious face. She was a lady, refined, well-educated, with tiny white hands and well-shod feet. There was nothing of the artificial cheek of the Parisian about her, but a quiet dignity which seemed almost incongruous in one so young. Indeed, he wondered that she was allowed about in the streets of Paris alone without a chaperone. Her piquant manner, with her utter disregard of all conventionality, amused him. True, she was older than Maud, but most possibly a bosom friend. If so, Maud was probably in hiding in Paris, and this pretty girl had been sent to him as Cupid's messenger. I wanted to see you on a matter which closely concerned Mr. Statham. Anything that concerns Mr. Statham concerns myself, Miss Lorena, he said. I'm his confidential secretary. I've ascertained that, otherwise I would not have dared to speak to you. I want to warn you. Of what? Of a deeply laid conspiracy to wreck Mr. Statham's life, she said. There have arisen recently 2 men who are now determined to lay bare the secret of the millionaire's past in revenge for some old grievance, real or fancied. For the purposes of blackmail, eh? He asked. Every rich man is constantly being subjected to attempted blackmail in some form or other. No, they have no desire to obtain money. Their sole intention is to expose Mr. Statham. Most men who are unsuccessful are eager to denounce the methods of their more fortunate friends, he said, smiling. Mr. Statham has no fear of exposure, I assure you. The girl looked him straight in the face with a long, steady gaze. Ah, I see, she exclaimed after a pause. You treat me as an enemy, Mr. Rolfe, not as a friend. The end of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux. Chapter 36. The Locked Door in Park Lane. Excuse me, Miss Lorena. I do not, he declared quickly. Only we have heard so many threats of exposure that to cease to regard them seriously. Mr. Statham's high reputation is sufficient guarantee to the public. I quite admit that, answered the girl. It is not the present that is in question, but the past. In these days of hustle, a man's past matters but little. It is what he is, not what he was, which the public recognize. Personally, she said, I hold Mr. Statham in highest esteem. I have never met him, it's true, but I have knowledge of certain kind and generous actions on his part. Actions which have brought happiness and prosperity to those who have fallen upon misfortune. For that reason I resolved to speak to you and warn you of the plot in progress. Do you happen to know a certain Mr. John Adams? Rolfe started and stared at her. What could she know of the Damocles sword suspended over the house of Statham? Well, he answered guardedly, I once met a man of that name, I think. Recently? About a month ago. You knew nothing of him prior to that? Rolfe hesitated. Well, no, he replied. He made pretense of being friendly with you. Yes, but to tell you the truth, I was somewhat suspicious of him. What do you know of him? Tell me. I happen to be well acquainted with him, the girl responded. It is he who had arisen like one from the grave and intends to avenge the wrong which he declares that Mr. Statham had done him. Recently? No, years ago, when they were brought together, and Mr. Statham was still a poor man. Charlie Rolfe was silent. He knew Adams. He knew, too, that evil was intended. He had warned old Sam Statham, but the latter had not heeded. Adams had had the audacity to approach him in confidence, believing that he might be bought over. When he had discovered that the millionaire's secretary was incorruptible, he openly declared his sinister intentions. I had no idea you were acquainted with Adams, he said, still puzzled to know who she was and what was her motive. I happen to know certain details of the plot, she answered. And you will reveal them to me? He asked in quick anxiety. Upon certain conditions. And what are they? I am all attention. The first is that you will not seek to learn the identity of the person who is associated with Mr. Adams in the forthcoming exposure. And the second is that you say nothing to Mr. Statham regarding our secret meeting. Why? He asked, not quite understanding the reason of her last stipulation. I thought you wished to warn Mr. Statham. No, I warn you. You can take measures of precaution on Mr. Statham's behalf without making explanation. Mr. Statham has already seen John Adams and recognized him. He is already forewarned. And he has not taken any steps in self-defense, she cried quickly. Why need you trouble? Why? Because that man Adams has sworn to hound him to self-destruction. Rolfe shrugged his shoulders and replied, Mr. Statham has really no apprehension of any unpleasantness, Miss Lorena. It is true that in the old days the 2 men were friends, and apparently they quarrelled. Adams was lost for a few years to all who knew him, and now suddenly reappears to find his old acquaintance wealthy beyond the dreams of avarice, and seeks, as many more before him have done, to profit by his former friendship. Or enmity, added the girl, lowering her sunshade a little until for a moment It hid her features. I do not think you realize the dastardly cunning of the plot in progress. It has not only as its object the ruin of the credit of the house of Statham brothers, but the creation of a scandal which Mr. Samuel Statham will not dare to face. He must either fly the country or commit suicide. Well, the latter is expected by the two men who have combined are now perfecting the ingenious conspiracy. It's believed by them that he will take his own life. Charlie Rolfe reflected for a moment. He recollected old Sam's terrible agitation on the day when he recognized John Adams leaning against the railings of the park. Of late, the great financier had betrayed signs of unusual nervousness and had complained several times of insomnia. To his secretary, knowledge he had spent 2 nights that very week in walking the streets of London from midnight until dawn, ostensibly to do charitable actions to the homeless, but in reality because his mind was becoming unbalanced by the constant strain of not knowing from one moment to another when Adams would deal a staggering blow. Had there been any question of blackmail, the aid of solicitors and of Scotland Yard could have been invoked, but there had been no thread beyond the statement made openly to Rolfe by the man who had intended to encompass the ruin of the eccentric millionaire and philanthropist. I think, Miss Lorena, that we need have no fear of Mr. Statham doing anything rash, he said. But why is it hoped that he will prefer to take his life rather than face any exposure? Because they will profit by his death, profit to an enormous degree. But how can Adams profit? He has had no dealings with Mr. Statham of late. Not Adams, but his friend. The latter will become wealthy. And may I not know his name? No, that is a stipulation which I make. For the present, it is sufficient that you should be made aware of the broad lines of the plot, and that its main object is the death of Samuel Statham. And you wish me to tell him all this? Certainly, only without explaining that I was your informant. Why do you wish to conceal the fact, Miss Lorena? He asked. Surely he would be only too delighted to be able to thank you for your warning. She shook her head, saying, If it were known that I had exposed their plans, it would place me in peril. They are determined and relentless men, who would willingly sacrifice a woman in order to gain their ends, which in this case is a large fortune. And you will not tell me the name of Adams' associates in the matter? No, I cannot do that. Please do not ask me, she answered hurriedly. Rolfe was again silent for a few moments. At last he asked, Cannot you tell me something of the past relations between Adams and Statham? You seem to know all the details of the strange affair. Adams makes certain serious allegations which he can substantiate. There's a certain witness whom Mr. Statham believes to be dead, but who is still alive and is now in England. A witness of what? Asked Rolfe quickly. Of the crime which Adams alleges. Crime? What crime? Ejaculated the young man in surprise, staring at his pretty companion. Some serious offence. But of what nature I am not permitted to explain to you. Why not, Miss Lorena? You must. Remember that Mr. Statham is in ignorance of this. I mean that Adams intends to charge him with the crime. Surely the position is most serious. I imagine that Adams' charges were criticism of Mr. Statham's methods of finance. Finance does not enter into it at all, said the girl. The delegation is a secret crime by which the millionaire laid the foundation of his fortune, a crime committed abroad and of which there are 2 witnesses still living. Men who were, until a few weeks ago, believed to be dead. But you tell me that Adams' associate will, if Mr. Statham commits suicide, profit to an enormous amount. Will you not explain? If this is so, why have they not attempted to levy blackmail? If the charge has foundation, which I do not for one moment believe, then surely Mr. Statham would be prepared to make payment and hush up the affair. He would not be human if he refused. The pair are fully alive to the danger of any attempt to procure money by promise of secrecy, she replied. They have already fully considered the matter and arrived at the conclusion that to compel Mr. Statham to take his own life is a wiser and easier course. You seem to be in their confidence, Miss Lorena, he said, gazing at the pretty girl at his side. Yes, I am. That's why I am unable to reveal to you the name of Adams' companion, she replied. All I can tell you is that the intention is to make against him a terrible charge of which they possess evidence, which is apparently overwhelming. Then you know the charge it is intended to bring against him, eh? Yes, was the prompt answer. To me it seems outrageous, incomprehensible, and yet if it is really true, it would account to a very great degree of Mr. Statham's eccentricity of which I have so often read in the papers. No one enters his house in Park Lane. Is not that so? He is shy and does not care for strangers, was Rolf's response. But it said in the paper only a week ago that nobody has ever been upstairs in that house except himself. There's a door on the stairs, they say, which is always kept locked and bolted. And if that is so, well, have you ever been upstairs, Mr. Rolf? Tell me. I'm very anxious to know. I make no secret of it, was his reply, smiling the while. I have never been upstairs. Entrance there is forbidden. Even to you, his confidential secretary. Yes, even to me. And yet there are signs of the upstairs rooms being occupied, she remarked. I've seen lights there myself as I passed the house. I was along Park Lane late one evening last week. So you have been recently in London? London is my home. I'm only here on a visit, was her reply. And ascertaining you were coming here, I resolved to see you. And has a serious allegation which Adams intends to bring any connection with the mystery concerning the mansion? Yes, it has. In what way? She paused, as though uncertain whether or not to tell the truth. Because, she said at last, because I firmly believe from facts known to me that confirmation of the truth of Adams's charge will be discovered beyond that locked door. The end of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux. Chapter 37. Max Barclay is inquisitive. Miss Rolfe has left the firm's employ, sir. Left? Left Cunnington's? Gasped Max Barclay, staring open-mouthed at Mr. Warner, the buyer. Yes, sir, she left suddenly yesterday morning, repeated the dapper man with the pen behind his ear. But this is most extraordinary. To leave at a moment's notice. I thought she was so very comfortable here. She always spoke so kindly of you, and for the consideration with which you always treated her. I was very kind of her, I'm sure, replied the buyer. But it is a rule here, a moment's notice on either side. But why? Why has she left? Warner hesitated. He, of course, knew the truth, but he was not anxious to speak it. Some little misunderstanding, I think. With you? Oh, dear, no. She was called down to the counting house yesterday morning, and she did not return. Then she has been discharged, eh? Asked Max in a hard voice. I believe so, sir. At least it would appear so. And are they in the habit of discharging assistants in this manner, throwing them out of a home and out of employment at a moment's notice? Is Mr. Cunnington himself aware of it? It would be Mr. Cunnington himself who discharged her, was the buyer's answer. No other person has authority either to engage or discharge. But there must be a reason for a dismissal, exclaimed Max. Certainly, but only Mr. Cunnington knows that. Can I see him? Well, at this hour he is generally very busy indeed. But if you go down to the counting house in the next building and ask for him, he may give you a moment. Thank you, Mr. Warner, Barclay said, a little abruptly, and turning on his heel left the department. She hasn't told him evidently, remarked one girl assistant to the other. I'm sorry Rolfie's gone. She wasn't half a bad sort. She was old Warner's favourite too. Or her young gentleman would never have been allowed to talk to her in the shop. If you or I had had a young man to come and see us as she had, we would have been fired out long ago. I wonder who a young man really is, remarked the second girl, watching him as he strode out, a lithe figure in a well-cut suit of grey tweeds. Well, he's a thorough gentleman, just like a brother, remarked her companion. I saw him in his motorboat up at Hampton the Sunday before last. He's completely gone on her. I wonder what'll happen now. I don't think much of the new girl, do you? Does her hair awfully badly. Unconscious of the criticism he had evoked, Max Barclay descended the stairs, passed through the long shops, crowded as they always were in the afternoon, into the adjoining building, and sought audience of the titular head of the great firm. After waiting for some time in an outer office, he was shown in. The moment he asked his question, Mr. Cunnington grasped the situation. I very much regret, sir, that it is not my habit to give information to a second party concerning the dismissal of any of my assistants. If the young lady applies for a character, she is perfectly entitled to have it. But I apply for a character, said Max promptly. You're not an employer, sir. She has not applied to you for a situation. No, But I may surely know the reason she has left your service, Max pointed out. A brother who is abroad just now is my most intimate friend. Mr. Cunnington stroked his dark beard thoughtfully, but shook his head, saying, I much regret, Mr. Barclay, that I am unable to give you the information you seek. Would it not be better to ask the young lady herself? But she has left, and I have no idea of her address, exclaimed Barclay. Can you furnish me with it? The head of Cunnington's Limited took up the telephone receiver and asked for a certain Mr. Hughes, of whom he made inquiry if Miss Rolfe had left her address. There was a wait of a few moments. Then Mr. Cunnington turned and said, The young lady left no address. She was asked, but refused to give one. Max's heart sank within him. She had been dismissed at an instant's notice, and was lost to him. He turned upon Mr. Cunnington in quick anger and said, So I am to understand that you refuse me all information concerning her. I merely adhere to my rules, sir. Any dismissal of my assistants is a matter between myself and the person dismissed. I am not called upon to give details or reasons to outsiders. I regret that I am very busy, and must wish you good afternoon. Max Barclay bit his lip. He did not like the brisk, business-like air of the man. I shall call upon Mr. Statham, whom I happen to know, he said, and I shall invoke his aid. You are perfectly at liberty to do just as you like, my dear sir. Even Mr. Statham exercises no authority over the assistants in this establishment. It's my own department, and I brook no interference. Max did not reply, but left the office and strode out into Oxford Street, pushing past a crowd of women around the huge shop windows, admiring the feminine finery there displayed so temptingly. Marian, his Marian, had disappeared. She had been dismissed, in disgrace evidently, probably for some petty fault or for breaking one of the 100 rules by which every assistant was bound. He had always heard Mr. Cunnington spoken of as a most lenient and even generous employer. Yet his treatment of Marian had been anything but just or humane. When he thought of it, his blood boiled. Charlie was away, he knew. He had telephoned to his rooms that very morning, but his man had replied that his master had left hurriedly for the continent. For Paris, he thought. At the corner of Bond Street, he halted and glanced at his watch. Should he try to find Charlie by telegraph, or should he take the bull by the horns and go and see old Sam Statham? His well-beloved had disappeared. Would the old financier assist him to discover the truth? He was well aware that for a comparative stranger to be deceived in that big house in Park Lane was exceptional. Old Levy had his orders, and few among the many callers ever placed a foot over the carefully guarded threshold. Still, he resolved to make the attempt, and with that object jumped into a taxicab which happened at the moment to be passing. Alighting at the house, he presented his card to old Levy, who opened the door and asked the favour of a few moments' conversation with Mr. Statham. The old servant scrutinized the card closely and took stock of the visitor, who, noticing his hesitation, added, Mr. Statham will remember me, I believe. Levy asked him into the hall with a dissatisfied grunt, and disappeared to return a few moments later and usher the visitor into the presence of the millionaire. Old Samuel, who had been dozing over a newspaper in his easy chair near the fireplace, rose and through his spectacles regarded his visitor with some suspicion. The blinds were drawn, shading the room from the afternoon sun. Therefore, Max found the place was in comparative darkness after the glare outside. In a few moments, however, when his eyes grew accustomed to the semi-darkness, he saw the old fellow wave his hand in the direction of a chair, saying, I am very glad you called, Mr. Barclay, very glad. Indeed, curiously enough, I intended to write to you only yesterday upon a business matter, but I was too busy. Barclay seated himself, full of surprise that the great financier should wish to consult him upon any business matter. Well, Mr. Statham, he said, I may as well tell you at once that I am here to seek your kind assistance and help in a purely personal matter, a matter which closely concerns my own happiness. Statham pricked up his ears. He knew what was coming. Marian Rolfe had told him of a visit there. Well, he asked coldly in a changed manner. You possibly are unaware that I am engaged to be married to Marian Rolfe, the sister of your secretary, a young lady in whom you were kind enough to take an interest and obtain for her a situation at Cunnington's. The old man nodded, his countenance sphinx-like. The lady in question has been dismissed by Mr. Cunnington at a moment's notice, and he refuses to tell me the reason of his very remarkable action. I want you to be good enough to obtain a response from me. And where is the young lady? Asked the wary Statham. Nobody knows. She would leave no address. Then you are unaware of her whereabouts? She has disappeared. Extraordinary, the old fellow remarked, reflecting deeply for a moment. Yes, I cannot imagine why, in the circumstances, she has not written to me, Max declared, the expression upon his face betraying his deep distress. It is certainly strange, the old man agreed. Girls at Cunnington's are not often discharged in that manner. Cunnington himself is always most lenient. Have you seen him? Yes, and he absolutely refuses any information. In that case, Mr. Barclay, I don't see very well how I can assist you. The management and organization of the concern are left to him as managing director. I really cannot interfere. But was it not through you that Marianne, without previous experience or apprenticeship, was engaged there? Yes, I have some recollection of sending a line of recommendation to Cunnington, was the millionaire's response. But of course my interest ended there. My secretary asked me to write the note, and I did so. Then you really cannot obtain for me the information I desire? But why are you so inquisitive, eh? Snapped the old man. Surely the lady will tell you the reason of her dismissal. I don't know where she is. A fact which is, well, rather curious. Shall we designate it? The old man remarked meaningly. You mean to imply that her instant dismissal has cast a slur upon her character, and that she fears to meet me lest she be compelled to tell me the truth? He said slowly as the suggestion dawned upon him. Ah, yes. You refuse to help me, Mr. Statham, because I love her. And his face became pale, hard-set, and determined. The end of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane. Chapter 38. Friend or foe? The two men were silent for some moments. Statham was watching his visitor's face. To him it was at least satisfactory to know that Marianne had disappeared, fearing to let her lover know the reason of her sudden dismissal lest he should misjudge her. Truth to tell, he had anticipated that she would have gone straight to Barclay and told him the truth. Within himself he acknowledged that he had played the poor girl a scoundrelly trick, but consoled himself with the thought that when a man's life was at stake, as his was, any mode of escape became justifiable. At last the old man stirred in his chair and turning to Max said, Please understand plainly it is not because I refuse to help you, but because it is not within my province to dictate to Cunnington replies regarding his assistance. But you hold a controlling interest in the firm, declared the other. That may be so, but I have nothing to do with the details of organization, he replied. Now, Mr. Barclay, let us end this matter with an expression of my regret at being unable to assist you. Perhaps, however, I may be able to do so in another direction. In another direction? He echoed. How? In a small matter of business. Max Barclay was both surprised and interested. He knew quite well that Statham could, if he wished, give him previous knowledge that would enable him to make a considerable coup. Ignorance of Marianne's visit to the old man or the cause of her dismissal allowed him to regard the millionaire with feelings of friendliness and to reflect that, after all, he had no power to dictate to Cunnington. You know, Mr. Barclay, he said, I frequently obtain confidential knowledge of what is transpiring in the world of finance. The other day it came to my ears through a source it is unnecessary to mention that the Adriatic Railway concession has been placed before you. Max opened his eyes. He believed that not a soul except the man who had joined him in partnership was aware of this. The information must have come from Constantinople, he thought. That is true, he admitted. A big thing, remarked the old man in his croaking voice. A very big thing indeed. Means prosperity to the Balkan countries. But pardon me if I ask one or two questions. Do not think I have any intention of going behind your back or attempting to upset your plans. I merely asked for information because, as perhaps you know, there is but one man in London who could float such a thing, and it is myself. I know, Mr. Statham, that we shall be compelled to come to you when we have the concession all in order. You will, he said with a smile. But can you, without injury to yourself, tell me who is your associate in this business? A Frenchman, Mr. Jean Adam of Constantinople. Statham's face never moved a muscle. Of this he was already quite well aware. An old friend of yours, I suppose? Not exactly an old friend. I met him for the first time about a month or so ago, responded Max. And what do you know of him? Nothing much, except that I believe him to be a man of the highest integrity, and the possessor of many friends interested in high finance. Oh, and what causes you to believe that? Well, we first met in Paris, where, having mooted the idea of a partnership, he introduced me to several well-known people, among them Baron Tellier, who arranged a match monopoly of Turkey, and Herr Hengelmann of Frankfurt, whom no doubt you know as a concessionaire of the German railway from Bosphorus to Baghdad. The old man gave vent to a dissatisfied grunt. Both men stand very high in the financial world, do they not? Max asked. Well, they did, replied old Sam, smiling. Did? What, have they gone under? No. Only Hengelmann has been in his coffin fully 2 years, and the Baron died at Nice last winter. What? Cried Max, starting forward. I repeat what I say, Mr. Barclay. Your friend Adam has been indulging in a pretty fiction. Are you sure? Are you quite sure they are dead? Most certainly. I was staying in the same hotel at Nice when the Baron died, and I followed him to the grave. He was a great friend of mine. Max Barclay sat stunned. Until that moment he had believed in Jean Adam and his plausible tales, but he now saw how very cleverly he had been deceived and imposed upon. You're surprised, he laughed. But you must remember that you can get a decent suit of gentlemanly clothes for £5, and visiting cards are only 2 shillings a hundred. People so often overlook those 2 important facts in life. Thousands of men can put off their identity and their clothes. But Adam, do you happen to know him? Max asked. If you do, it'll surely be a very friendly act to tell me the truth. Well, replied the elder man with some hesitancy, I may as well tell you at once that the Sultan has never given any concession for the railway from Nice to San Giovanni di Medua to cross Turkish territory, and will never give it. He fears Bulgaria and Serbia too much, for he never knows what power may be behind them. And after all, who can blame him? Why should he open his gates to an enemy? Albania is always in unrest, for in the north the Christians predominate, and there is bound to be trouble ere long. Then you believe that the whole thing is a fiction? Most certainly it is. If there is any idea of the Sultan giving an Ira Day, I should most certainly know of it. I have good agents in Constantinople. No, take it from me that the concession will never be given. It's not to Turkey's interest to allow the development of Serbia and Bulgaria. Therefore, your friend's pretty tale is all a fairy story. Then why is he pressing me to go to Constantinople? Max asked. Statham shrugged his shoulders, indicative of ignorance. Perhaps he thinks you will plank down money, he suggested. He wants nothing until I myself am satisfied with the bona fides of the business. Stuff on his part, most likely. He's a past master of the art. How well do you know him? Sufficiently well to have nothing to do with him. Then that accounts for his refusal to allow me to confide in you, said Barclay. I see the reason now. Of course, act just as you think fit. Only recollect that what I have told you is bedrock fact. The man who calls himself Adam is a person to be avoided. Have you had dealings with him? Just once, and they had a very unpleasant result. He reflected upon certain remarks and criticisms which the Frenchman had uttered concerning Statham and his normal methods. In the light of what he now knew, he saw that the 2 men were enemies. It seemed as though one man wished to tell him something, and yet was hesitant. Have you put any money into the scheme? The millionaire asked. Not yet. Then don't. Tell him to take it somewhere else. Better still, tell him to bring it to me. You need not, however, say that it is I who warned you. Leave him in the dark in that direction. He's a clever fellow, extraordinarily clever. Who is with him now? Well, he has a friend named Lyle, a mining engineer. Leonard Lyle? A hunchback? Asked Statham quickly. The millionaire's countenance went a trifle paler, and about the corners of his thin lips was a hard expression. To him, the seriousness of the conspiracy was only too apparent. Those 2 men intended that he should be driven to take his own life, to die an ignominious death. You have spoken to this man? He asked in as steady a voice as he could. Once or twice. He seems to possess a very intimate knowledge of Serbia, Bulgaria, and European Turkey. Is he an adventurer like Adam? Not exactly, was a rather ambiguous reply. But his association with Adam shows plainly that fraud is intended. But why does he want me to go post-haste out to Turkey? Queried Max, who had risen from his chair in the excitement of this sudden revelation which caused his brilliant scream to vanish into thin air. To induce confidence, I expect. he would have introduced you to some men wearing fezzes and declared them to be the pashas, high in favour of the Yildiz kiosk. Then, before you left Constantinople, he would have held you to your bargain to put money into the thing. Oh, never fear, you would have fallen a victim in one way or another. So it is best that you should know the character of the two men with whom you are dealing. Take my advice. Treat them with caution, but refuse to stir from London. They will no doubt use every persuasion to induce you to go, but your best course is to hear all the arguments, watch the gradual development of their scheme, and inform me of it. Will you do it? Will my information assist you in any way, Mr. Statham? Yes, it will, very materially, the old man answered. I have revealed to you the truth, and I ask you in return to render me this little assistance. What I desire to know is their movements daily, and how they intend to act. Towards whom? Towards myself. Then they are associated against you, you believe? I suspect them to be, the old man replied. I know them to be my enemies. They are, like thousands of other men, jealous of my success, and believe they have a grievance against me, one that is entirely unfounded. And if I do so, will you assist me to obtain knowledge of the reason why Marianne Rolfe has been dismissed? Asked Max eagerly. The old man hesitated, but only for a second. It was easy enough to give him a letter to Cunnington, and afterwards to telephone to Oxford Street instructions to the head of the firm to refuse a reply. So, consenting, he took a sheet of notepaper and scribbled a few lines of request to Mr. Cunnington, which he handed to Max, saying, There, I hope that will have the desired effect, Mr. Barclay. On your part, remember, you will keep in with Adam and Lyle and give me all the information you can gather. I know how to repay a friendly service rendered to me, so you are no doubt well aware. You will be welcome here at any hour. I shall tell Levy to admit you. That's a bargain, the younger man asserted. When will Rolfe return? Tomorrow. Or next day. He's in Paris. Shall I tell him you wish to see him? Please. But say nothing regarding Adam or his friend. Our compact is a strictly private one, remember? And then Max, grasping the hands of the man whom he believed was his friend, placed a note in his pocket and went out into the blazing hot September afternoon. As he disappeared along the pavement, the old millionaire watched him unseen from behind the blind. To the friendship of that man whom I have wronged, I shall owe my life, he murmured aloud. And then, crossing to the telephone on his table, he asked for Mr. Cunnington. The end of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux. Chapter 39. The City of Unrest. 10 days had passed since Charlie had met the mysterious Lorena in Paris. To both Charlie and Max, though now separated by the breadth of Europe, they had been breathless, anxious, never to be forgotten days. The ominous words of Lorena ever recurred to him. Apparently the girl knew far more than she had told him, and a declaration that confirmation of Adams's charges would be found beyond that white enamelled door in Park Lane gripped his senses. He could think of nothing else. She had left him in the Rue de Rivoli, outside the gardens, refusing her address or any further account of herself. She had warned him. That was, she said, all sufficient. He blamed himself 1,000 times for not having followed her, for not having sought some further information concerning the peril of old Sam Statham. Yet the afternoon following, just as he was about to drive from the Grand Hotel to the Gare du Nord to return to London, one of the clerks from Old Broad Street had arrived, bearing a letter from the head of the firm, giving him instructions to proceed to Servia at once and transact certain business with the government regarding certain copper concessions in the district of Kopernik. The deal meant the introduction of a considerable amount of British capital into Servia and had support from His Majesty King Peter downwards. Indeed, all were in favour save the opposition in the Skupčina, or Parliament, a set of unruly peasants who opposed every measure the Passage government put forward. The business brooked no delay. Therefore Charlie, that same night, entered the Orient Express, that train of dusty wagons lit which runs 3 times a week between Paris and Constantinople, and 3 days later arrived in Belgrade, the Servian capital. He was no stranger in that rather pleasant town, perched high up at the junction of the Save and the broad Danube. The passport officer at Semlin station recognized him and gave him a visa at once, and on alighting at Belgrade, the little ferret-eyed man idling outside the station did not follow him, for he knew him by sight and was well aware that the Grand Hotel was his destination. There were more spies in Belgrade than in any other city in Europe. So much foreign intrigue is ever in progress that the Serbian authorities are compelled to support a whole army of secret agents to watch and report. Hence it is that the stranger, from the moment he sets foot in Belgrade to the moment he leaves it, is watched and his every movement noted and reported. Yes, all is so well managed that the foreigner is never aware of the close surveillance upon him, and Belgrade is as gay a town in the matter of entertaining and general freedom as well as any other you may choose to name. During the days when, owing to the unfortunate events which terminated the reign of the half-imbecile King Alexander and the designing woman who became his queen, when England had suspended diplomatic negotiations, the great stakes held in the country by Statham brothers were in a somewhat precarious condition. For 2 years, Serbian finance had been in anything but a flourishing condition, but now, under the rule of King Peter, who had done his very utmost to reinstate his country to its former flourishing position, the confidence of Europe had been restored, and Statham brothers were ready to make further investments. In Charlie Rolfe, the great millionaire had the most perfect confidence. The letter he had sent him to Paris was clear and explicit in its instructions. If the concessions were confirmed by the Prime Minister Paschitz and the Council, 1,000,000 dinars or francs were already deposited in the National Bank of Serbia and could be drawn at an hour's notice upon Charlie's signature. So he drove to the Grand, the hotel with its great garish cafe, its restaurant where the starlet is perhaps more delicious than at the Hermitage in Moscow, and its excellent Zigan band. It was evening, so he ate a light meal and, fagged out by the journey, retired early. He tried to sleep but could not. The noise and clatter of the cafe below, the weird strains of the gypsy music, the rattle of the cabs over the cobbles, all combined to prevent slumber. And over all was a vivid recollection of that rather handsome girl who had called herself Lorena and who had declared that the reason of Statham's peril lay behind the door which he always kept so carefully secured. The hours passed slowly. He thought far more of Maud Petrovich and of what Lorena had told him than of the business he had to transact on the morrow. He was there in the city where Dr. Petrovich had been worshipped almost as a demigod, where the people cheered lustily as he drove out, and where he was called the Serbian patriot. Where was the statesman now? What was the actual truth of that sudden disappearance? Why had not Maud written? Surely she might at least have trusted him with the secret. The noise below had died away, and he knew that it must be 2 o'clock in the morning, the hour when the cafe closed. Presently there came up a rap on his door, and the night porter handed him a telegram. He tore it open mechanically, expecting it to be cipher from old Sam, but instead saw the signature Max. Scanning it eagerly, he held his breath. The news it contained staggered him. It stated that his sister Marianne had been discharged from Cunnington's, and her whereabouts were unknown. Have seen Statham, but cannot discover where your sister has gone. Can you suggest any friend she may have gone to visit? What shall I do? Am distracted. Wire immediately. Marianne left Cunnington's. Discharged, the telegram said. Was it possible, he thought, that old Sam would allow a discharge? He was certain he would not. He was his sister's friend as he was his own. Max's telegram added further to the burden of mystery upon him. What could it all mean? Marianne has evidently left Cunnington and disappeared. He tried to think to whom she would go in her distress. There was her Aunt Anne at Wimborne, her cousin Lucy, who had married the bank manager at Hereford, and there was her old schoolfellow, Mary Craven, who had only recently married Pelham, the manager of an insurance company in Moorgate Street. Those 3 addresses he wrote on a telegraph form, urging Max to make inquiry and report progress. This he dispatched, and again threw himself down, full of dark forebodings. If Marianne had really been discharged, she was in some disgrace. What could it possibly be? That it was something which she dared not face was proved by the fact that she had not confided in Max. She knew Maud's place of concealment without a doubt. Therefore, what more natural than she should have joined her? The whole affair was a complete enigma, rendered the more tantalizing by the distance which now separated him from London. Next morning he rose, took his coffee, and went out along the broad central boulevard, gay and lively in the sunlight, thronged by well-dressed ladies and smart officers in uniforms on the Russian model, as bright and pleasant a scene as can be witnessed anywhere outside Paris. Up the hill, past the royal palace, he went. In the royal garden, separated from the roadway by high iron railings, the band of the guards were playing, and over the palace floated the royal standard showing that His Majesty was in residence. Adjoining the palace was a large, square, castellated building painted white, and into this he turned, saluted by the gendarmes on duty. Ascending a broad flight of steps, he passed through the swing doors, presented his card, and was shown into the large antechamber of the President of the Council of Ministers, the strongest man in Serbia, Monsieur Nicholas Pasic. The long windows commanded a wide view of the towers and of the broad Danube shining in the morning sun, while upon the walls of the sombre apartment, with its floor of polished oak and antique furniture covered with crimson plush, was a portrait of King Peter and several full-length paintings of dead and gone statesmen. "His Excellency is engaged for a few moments with the Turkish minister," exclaimed a frock-coated secretary in French, "but he will give Monsieur audience almost immediately. His Excellency was going to Pirot, but has remained in order to see you. He received your telegram from Budapest." And so Charlie Rolfe remained gazing out of the window upon the quaint eastern town, watching the phantasmagoria of life up and down its principal thoroughfare. A company of infantry, headed by their band, marched past, hot and dusty, on their return from the early morning manoeuvres which the king had attended, as was his daily habit. And as it passed out of his sight, the long doors opened, and he was ushered into the adjoining room, the private cabinet of His Excellency the Premier, an elderly, pleasant-faced old gentleman with a long grey beard, who rose from his big writing-table to greet his visitor. The meeting was a most cordial one, His Excellency inquiring after the health of his old personal friend, Mr. Statham. Then, at the Prime Minister's invitation, Charlie seated himself and explained the nature of his mission. Monsieur Pasic heard him with interest to the end. Then he said, "Only yesterday His Majesty expressed to me his desire that we should attract British capital into Serbia. Therefore, all that you tell me is most gratifying to us. Mr. Statham, on his last visit here, had audience of His Majesty on the occasion of the loan, and I think they found themselves perfectly in accord. The development of the Copernic has long been desired, and I will this afternoon inform His Majesty of your visit and your proposals." Charlie then produced certain documents, reports of 2 celebrated mining engineers who had been sent out to Copernic by Statham brothers, and these they discussed for a long time. Presently Rolfe said, "By the way, Your Excellency, have you heard of late anything from Dr. Petrovich?" "Petrovich?" exclaimed the old statesman, starting quickly. "Petrovich? No," he almost snapped. "He has been living in England quite recently, but of late I've lost sight of him. I know," he went on, "that you and he had some little difference of opinion upon the customs war with Austria." "Yes, we did," remarked the grey-bearded old gentleman with a smile. "We differed upon one point. Afterwards, however, I found that my ideas were unsound, and I admitted it in this cappuccino. I heard that Petrovich was in London. The king invited him to come to Belgrade about 6 months ago, as he wished to consult him in private, but he declined the invitation." "Why?" "I think he feared an account of a political conspiracy which is known to have been formed against him. As you know, the opposition are his bitter opponents." "And they are opponents of His Majesty also," Rolfe remarked. "Exactly, a fact which, for the peace of Serbia, is most unfortunate." "Then you have no idea where I could find the doctor?" "Not the least, but—" and he paused, thinking for a moment. "Well, if I remember right, my wife told me that she had met his daughter Maud at dinner at the British legation one night recently." "Then she's in Belgrade!" Rolfe cried. "I'm not quite certain. I did not pay much attention to what she told me. I was preoccupied with other things. But I'll ask her and let you know. Or you might ask the wife of the British minister. You know her, of course." "Yes," Rolfe answered excitedly. "I'll call upon her this afternoon. I'm sure I'm very much indebted to Your Excellency for this information." And his spirits rose again at the thought that his sweet-faced, well-beloved was safe and well, and that, in all probability, she was actually in that city. The end of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux. Chapter 40 gives a clue. That afternoon, at as early an hour as he decently could, he called at the British legation, the big white mansion in the centre of the town. Both Sir Charles Harrison, the minister, and his charming wife were well known to him, for more than once he had been invited to dine on previous visits to Belgrade. The minister was out, but Lady Harrison received him in the big drawing room on the first floor, a handsome apartment filled with exquisite Japanese furniture and bric-a-brac, for prior to his appointment to Belgrade, the minister had been secretary to the British Embassy in Tokyo. The first greetings over, Charlie explained the object of his call, whereupon the minister's wife replied, "I think Mr. Passage is mistaken, Mr. Rolfe. I haven't seen Maud Petrovich for quite a year. She was on a visit to her aunt, Madame Konstantinovich, about a year ago and used to come here very often." Charlie's hopes fell again. "Perhaps the minister-president has made a mistake. It may have been at some other house Madame Passage met the doctor's daughter," he said. "Well, if she were in Belgrade, she would surely come to see me. All her friends come to me on Thursdays, as you know," replied the minister's wife, as a man brought in tea with lemon in the Russian style. He glanced around the handsome room and recollected the brilliant receptions at which he had been present. The British legation was one of the finest mansions in Belgrade, and Sir Charles gave weekly dinners to the diplomatic corps and his personal friends. He and his wife entertained largely to keep up the prestige of Great Britain amid that seething area of intrigue, political conspiracy, and great unrest. Within a small room off the drawing room, which was Sir Charles' private den, many a diplomatic secret had been brewed, and many an important matter affecting the best interests of Servia had been decided. Surely the post of Belgrade was one of the most difficult in the whole range of British diplomacy abroad. Before Charlie rose to go, Sir Charles entered, a middle-aged, merry, easy-going man who greeted him cheerily, saying, "Hello, Rolfe! Who'd have thought of seeing you here? And how is Mr. Statham? When will he buy us all up? Today?" Rolfe briefly explained the nature of his mission to the ex-president, and then, after a few minutes' chat, followed his host into the smaller room for a cigarette and chat. Eventually, Rolfe, lying back in an easy chair, said, "Do you know, Sir Charles, a very curious thing has happened recently in London?" "Oh, I see by the papers that lots of curious things have happened," was the diplomat's reply as he smiled upon his guest. "Oh, yes, I know, but this is a serious matter. Dr. Petrovich and his daughter Maud have disappeared." Sir Charles raised his eyebrows and was in a moment serious. "Disappeared? There's been nothing about it in the papers." "No, it's being kept dark. The police haven't been stirred about it. It was only a sudden removal from Cromwell Road, but both father and daughter and household furniture disappeared." "How? In what manner did the furniture disappear?" Rolfe explained, while Sir Charles sat listening open-mouthed. "Extraordinary!" he ejaculated when the younger man concluded. "What can be the reason of it? Petrovich is an old and dear friend of mine. Why, I knew him years ago when I was attaché here. He often wrote to me. The last letter I had was from London about 4 months ago." "And he is my friend too." "Yes, I know," was the other's reply. "It was whispered, Rolfe, that you were in love with the pretty Maud, eh?" "I don't deny it." "Why should you, if you love her?" "But she's disappeared without a word." "And you are in search of her?" "Most natural." "Well, I'll make inquiries and ascertain if she's been in Belgrade." "I don't believe she has, or we should certainly have seen something of her. My wife is very fond of her, you know." "I fear there's been foul play," Rolfe remarked. The minister shrugged his shoulders. "It's curious, to say the least, isn't it?" he observed. There, in confidence, Charlie told the minister of Marian's friendship with Maud, of the strange and mysterious confession on the night of the disappearance, and a steadfast refusal to betray the girl's secret. Sir Charles paused and reflected. "Political intrigue is at the bottom of this, depend upon it, Rolfe," he said at last. "Petrovich has enemies here, unscrupulous enemies, who would not hesitate to attempt his life. They fear that, if he returns to power as the king had invited him, they will find themselves prisoners in the fortress, and that means death, as you know. When the doctor acts, he acts boldly for the benefit of his country. He would make a clean sweep of his enemies once and for all." "Then you think they have anticipated this and killed him in secret?" cried Rolfe. "It is, I fear, quite possible," was the diplomat's reply. "What causes you to believe this?" "I possess secret knowledge." "Of a plot against him?" "He was fully aware of it himself. That is why he lived in England," the minister replied. "But surely, if he knew this, he might have taken steps for his self-protection," Rolfe exclaimed. "The fact that his furniture was spirited away to some unknown place makes it almost appear as though he was in accord with the conspirators." "No, I think not. The conspirators removed his furniture in order to prevent undue inquiries as to the doctor's disappearance. The emptying of the house may have been one to make it appear to the police that the doctor had suddenly removed, perhaps to avoid his creditors. Rolf shook his head. His opinion hardly coincided with that of the British diplomat. Besides, Max Barclay's story of having seen a man there closely resembling him wanted explanation. With what motive had an unknown man represented him on the night in question? "Maud Petrovich has never written to you?" asked Harrison. "Not a line." The minister pursed his lips. "Well," he said, "I'm perfectly sure if she's been in Belgrade, she would certainly have come to see us. My wife used to have frequent letters from her in London. I've not told Lady Harrison the reason of my inquiry, or any of the facts," Rolf said. "I thought I would leave it to you to tell her if you think proper. Up to the present, the doctor's disappearance has been kept secret between my friend Max Barclay, who was the doctor's most intimate chum in London, and myself." "At present I shall not tell my wife," declared the diplomat. "He was a man of secrets and knew how to keep one." "Who is Max Barclay?" asked the minister after a pause. Rolf explained, but said nothing regarding his engagement to his sister Marian. To it all, Sir Charles listened attentively without comment. At last, after a long silence, he said, "Well, look here, Rolf. A sudden thought has occurred to me. I think it possible that tomorrow, in a certain quarter, I shall be able to make a confidential inquiry regarding the whereabouts of the doctor. All that you have told me interests me exceedingly, because I have all along believed that very shortly Petrovich was returning to power and join forces with Paschich." "But didn't they quarrel a short time ago?" Rolf remarked. "Oh, a mere trifle. It was nothing. The Austrian press made a great stir about it, as they always do. All news from Serbia emanates from the factory across the river yonder at Semlin. If the journalists dared to put foot on Serbian soil, they'd soon find themselves under arrest, I can tell you. No, the broad lines of policy of both Petrovich and Paschich are identical. They intend to develop the country by the introduction of foreign capital. The king himself told me so at an audience I had a month ago. He then told me in confidence that he had invited the doctor to return and rejoin the ministry. That's why I firmly believe that the poor doctor, one of the best and most straightforward statesmen in Europe, has fallen victim to his enemies." "Then you'll set to work to discover what is known among the opposition?" urged the young man. "I promise you I will. But of course, in strictest confidence," was the minister's reply. "Petrovich is my friend as well as yours. I know only too well of the bitter enmity towards him in some quarters, especially among the partisans of the late king and a certain section of the opposition in the Skopchina. Mention of his name there causes cheers from the government benches, but howls from the enemies of law and order. There was some 3 years ago a dastardly plot against his life, as you know." "No, I didn't know it. I've never heard about it," was Rolf's reply. "Ah, he never speaks about it, of course," Sir Charles said reflectively. "While driving out at Topshida with his little orphan niece, of whom he was very fond, a bomb was thrown at the carriage. The poor child was blown to atoms, the horses were maimed, the carriage smashed to matchwood, and the coachman so injured that he died within an hour. The doctor alone escaped with nothing more serious than a cut across the cheek. But that terrible death of his dead sister's child was a terrible blow to him, and he has not been since in Belgrade. Because of that, I expect he has hesitated to obey the king's command to return to office." "Awful! I never knew of that. Maud has never told me," said Rolf. "What blackguards to kill an innocent child! Was the man who threw the bomb caught?" "Yes, and the conspiracy was revealed by the activity of the secret police. They made a report to the Minister of Justice, who showed it to me in confidence." "Then you actually know who threw the explosive?" "I know also who was responsible for the dastardly conspiracy, who aided and abetted it, and who furnished the assassins with money and promised a big reward if they encompassed the doctor's death," said the minister slowly and seriously. "You do? Who?" cried Rolf. "It was someone well known to you," was his reply. "The inquiries made by the Serbian police led them far afield from Belgrade. They traced the conspiracy to its source, a source which would amaze you, as it would stagger the world. And if I am not much mistaken, Rolf, this second plot has been formed and carried out by the same person whose first plot failed." "A person I know?" gasped the young man. The end of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux. Chapter 41. The Gateway of the East. The diplomat would say nothing more. When pressed by Charlie Rolfe, he said that it was a surmise. Until the truth was proved, he refused to speak more plainly. "You declare that the plot by which an innocent child died was formed by a friend of mine," the younger man exclaimed. "I tell you that such is my firm belief," Sir Charles repeated. "Tomorrow I will endeavour to discover whether the same influence that caused the explosion of the bomb at Topshida is responsible for the doctor's disappearance." "But cannot you be more explicit?" asked Rolfe. "Who is the assassin?" "The murderer of children." "At present I can say no more than what I have already told you," was the diplomat's grave response. "You believe that the same motive has led to the doctor's disappearance as was the cause of the bomb outrage at Topshida?" "I do." "Then much depends upon the doctor's death." "Very much. His enemies would reap a large profit." "His enemies in Skopchina, you mean?" "Those and others." He had private enemies also, secret ones that were even more dangerous than the blatant political orators. "Then private vengeance was the cause?" "No, not exactly. At least I think not," Sir Charles replied. "But please ask no more. I'll tell you the truth when I have established it." "I wish I could discover where Maud is. Surely it is strange that the Prime Minister's wife should have said she met her lately here in Belgrade." "Maud Petrovich is not in Servia. I am certain of that point." "Why?" "Because her father would never allow her to return here after the tragedy at Topshida." "The assassin, the man who threw the bomb, where is he?" "In the fortress, condemned to a life sentence," the diplomat answered. "He was caught while running away from the scene. A raw peasant from Valjevo, hired evidently to hurl the bomb. He was subjected to a searching examination, but would never reveal by whom he was employed. He was tried and condemned to solitary confinement, which he now is undergoing. You know the horrors of the fortress here on the Danube, with its subterranean cells, eh?" "I've heard of them," responded the younger man. "But even that fate is too humane for a man who would deliberately kill an innocent child." "A life sentence in the fortress is scarcely humane," the British minister remarked grimly. "No one has ever entered some of those underground dungeons built by the Turks centuries ago. Their horrors can only be surmised. To all outsiders who have wished to inspect the place, the Minister of Justice has refused admission." "Then the assassin has only received his deserts." "The person who formed the plot and used the ignorant peasant as his cat's paw should be there too, or even instead of him," declared Sir Charles angrily. "The peasant suffers while the real culprit gets off scot-free and unknown." "Then he is still unknown?" exclaimed Rolfe in surprise. "Save to perhaps 3 persons, of whom I am one, and also the man who threw the bomb. I've heard that the solitary confinement in a dark cell already worked its effect upon him. He is hopelessly insane." Rolfe drew a long breath and glanced around the cosy room with its long row of well-filled bookcases, its writing table, and its smaller tables filled with Japanese bric-a-brac, of which Sir Charles was an ardent collector. In the silence that fell, the footman tapped at the door and presented a card. Then Rolfe, declaring that he must go, rose, gripped the grey-haired minister's hand, and extracting from him a promise to tell the truth as soon as he had established it, followed the smart English footman down the stairs. That night, as he sat amid the clatter and music of the brilliantly lit Grand Café, he reflected deeply on all that had been told him, wondering who was a friend who had been responsible for the outrage which had induced the doctor to forsake his native and never to return. Servia was a country of intrigue and unrest, as is every young country. He looked around the tables at the gay crowd of smart officers with their ribbons and crosses upon their breasts and their well-dressed womenkind, and wondered whether any fresh conspiracy was in progress. The rule of King Peter, malign though that monarch had been, had brought beneficent reforms to Servia, and yet there was an opposition who never ceased to hurl hard epithets against him and to charge him with taking part in a plot of the true meaning of which he certainly had no knowledge. Belgrade is a city in which plots against the monarchy are hinted at and whispered in the corners of the drawing rooms, where diplomacy is a mass of intrigue, a city of spies and sycophants, of concession hunters and political cliques. Gay, pleasant, and easy-going, with its fine boulevard, its pretty Calamagdan garden, and its spick-and-span new streets, it's different to any other capital of Europe, more full of tragedy, more full of plot and counterplot. Austria is there, ever seeking by a swarm of secret agents to stir up strife and to organize demonstrations against the reigning dynasty. Germany is there seeking influence and making promises, while Bulgaria is ever watchful. Turkey is silent and spectral, and Great Britain looks on neutral, but noting ever more of the deep diplomatic juggling of the powers. At night, amid the clatter, the laughter, and the gypsy music of the Grand Café, with its billiard tables in the center of its restaurant adjoining, the stranger would never dream of its close proximity to the tragedy of a throne. Just as the bright lights and calm moonlit sea throw a glamour over that plague spot Monte Carlo, until the visitor believes that no evil can lurk in the terrestrial paradise, so in Belgrade is everything so pleasant, so happy, so careless that the stranger would never dream that the whole city sits ever upon the edge of a volcano, and that the red flag of revolt is ready at any moment to be hoisted. Charlie Rolfe knew Belgrade and knew the tragedy that underlay its brightness. What greater tragedy could there be than the death of the innocent child blown to atoms by the bomb? Who could be the culprit whom Sir Charles had told him was his friend? He had known the doctor well, but not intimately as Max Barclay had done. Curious that Max had told him nothing concerning the tragic incident which had caused a Serbian statesman and patriot to turn his back upon his beloved country and live in studious seclusion in England. Max had told him many things, but had never mentioned that subject. Was Max Barclay the friend to whom Sir Charles had referred? Was it really possible? He held his breath, contemplating the end of his half-smoked cigar and wondering. It was a strange suspicion. Of late, ever since Max had charged him with having been present at Cromwell Road on the night of the disappearance, he had somehow held aloof from the man to whom Marianne was so devoted. And now, even she had disappeared. What could it mean? Did Max Barclay really know how and why Marianne had disappeared, and for motives of his own was making a mystery? The message from Barclay worried him. Marianne was missing. Why had she left Cunnington's? She must have left of her own accord, he felt confident. She would never be discharged. Sam Statham would never for a moment allow that. A tall man with a fair pointed beard approached him, raised his head and gripped his hand. It was Drukovich, the director of the National Theatre, and a friend of his. The newcomer seated himself at the table, and the waiter brought a tiny glass of Slivovitsa, or plum gin, that liqueur so dear to the Serbian palate. Drukovich was one of the best known and most popular men in Belgrade. A thoroughgoing cosmopolitan and a man of the world. Sometimes he went to London, and whenever there, Charlie entertained him at his club, or they went to the theatre and supped at the Savoy. As they chatted, Rolfe explaining that he was in Serbia upon financial matters as usual, Drukovich nodded to the officers and civilians whom he knew, many of them famous for the part they had played in the recent coup d'etat. Some of them, indeed, wore the white enamel cross, which decoration marked them as partisans of the dynasty of the Karageorge. And meanwhile the orchestra were playing the popular waltz from the Merry Widow, the air haunting everybody and everyone. That night there was a court hall at the palace, and the forthcoming event was upon everyone's lips. There was seldom any entertainment at the new Connaught, for His Majesty led a very quiet life, the almost ascetic life of a soldier, riding out at dawn, attending to duties of state during the day, and retiring early. Perhaps the most maligned man in all Europe, King Peter of Serbia was nevertheless known to his intimate around the throne to be a most conscientious ruler, fully aware of all his responsibilities and striving ever to pacify the various political factions, sustaining the prestige of Serbia abroad and ameliorating the condition of his people at home. The truth regarding King Peter had never been written. Of libels and vile calumnies there had been volumes, but no journalist had ever dared to put into print the real facts of King Peter's innocence of any connivance at the dastardly murder of Alexander and Draga. Those who knew the real facts admired King Peter as a man and fearless patriot, but those who gathered the information from sensational newspapers and scurrilous books emanating from Austria believed every lie that the backstairs scribes chose to write. Drukovich was one of the men who knew the truth, and many a time he had explained them to his friend, who in turn had told old Sam Statham, the hard-headed misanthrope whose prejudices were so strong, and yet the chords of whose heartstrings were so readily touched. Sam had lent money to Serbia, huge sums. And why? Because he knew His Majesty personally and had heard from his own lips the story of his tragic difficulties and his high aspirations. Once indeed, in that silent study in Park Lane, he had been reading a confidential report from Belgrade predicting a black outlook when he turned to his secretary and said, "Rolf, there'll be trouble in Serbia. But even though I may lose £1,000,000 I've loaned, it'll not trouble me. I've tried to assist an honest man who is at the same time a philanthropist and a king." Charlie Rolfe recollected these words at that moment as he sat amid the noise and chatter of the cafe, where above every other sound rose the sweet, tuneful strains of the waltz that had within the past few weeks gripped all Europe. There was something bizarre, something incongruous with it all. He was thinking of his lost love, his sweet-faced Maud with the unruly wisp of hair straying across her white brow. Where was she? Aye, where was she? The end of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of The Pauper of Barclay. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Barclay by William Le Queux. Chapter 42. Advances a theory. Next day and the next, Charlie called upon the British minister but could obtain no further information. Sir Charles had failed to establish a suspicion and therefore declined to say anything further. Rolf, on his part, had learned from Dukovich the full details of the dastardly attempt upon the doctor's life at Topshida and how the little child had been blown to atoms. The escape of Petrovich had been little short of miraculous, and it was now whispered that the conspiracy had no political significance but was an act of private vengeance. Whatever its motive might have been, it had had the desired effect on preventing the doctor from returning to Serbia. In various quarters, Rolf made diligent inquiry and established without a doubt that Maud Petrovich had within the past 10 days or so been in Belgrade. A young officer of the King's Guard, a Lieutenant Yankovich, had seen her in the Tsar Daskanova Uliza. He described her as wearing a white serge gown and a big black hat. She was walking with a short, elderly, grey-haired woman, undoubtedly a foreigner, English or American. He was marching with his company, or would have stopped and spoken to her. Another person discovered by Dukovich was a domestic who had once been in the doctor's service. She declared that early one morning, when going from her home to the house in the Krunska, where she was now employed, she met her young mistress Maud with the same elderly woman, a woman rather shabbily dressed. The pair were passing the Russian legation, and she stopped and spoke. The young lady had told her that she was only on a flying visit to Belgrade and that she was leaving again on the morrow. To the servant's inquiries regarding the doctor, his daughter was silent, as though she did not wish to mention her father. According to the servant's description, Mademoiselle Maud looked very worn and pale, as though she had passed many sleepless nights full of anxiety and dread. The Prime Minister's wife had no recollection of telling her husband about meeting the doctor's daughter. Somebody else must have mentioned it to the grey-bearded statesman, who, full of the cares of office, had forgotten who it had been. A third person who had seen Maud, however, was one of the agents of secret police on duty at the railway station. It was this man's work to watch arriving passengers and detail agents to watch any suspected to be foreign spies. According to his report made to the chief of police, Mademoiselle Petrovich arrived in Belgrade late one night with an elderly Englishwoman and a tall, thin man, probably a German. They hired a cab and drove out to an address near the Botanical Gardens on the opposite side of the city. Recognizing who she was, he did not instruct an agent to follow her. The two ladies returned to the railway station 4 days later and left again by the Orient Express for Budapest. The officials of the International Express passing through Serbia had compelled to furnish to the secret police the names and nationalities of all passengers travelling. When the train arrives in Belgrade, the commissario is always handed the list which is filed for reference. Upon the list on that particular day was shown the names of Mademoiselle Maud Pavlovich of Belgrade and Mrs. Wood of London. The girl had only slightly disguised her name. These results of Charlie's inquiry showed quite plainly that his well-beloved was alive and that she had been in Serbia with some secret object. The police were unaware of the exact address near the Botanical Gardens where the couple stayed. It's only within their province to watch suspected foreigners. Of Serbians they take no account. Therefore, beyond the facts already stated, Rolf could discover nothing. Day after day he remained in Belgrade, sometimes spending the afternoon by going for a trip across the Danube to that dull and rather uninteresting frontier town of Hungary, Semlin, and always hoping to be able to discover something further, some clue to the strange disappearance of the doctor, or the real reason why his Maud was so determined to hold aloof from him. Thrice he received wild telegrams from Max Barclay asking for information as to where he might best seek news of Marion. News of her? A brother was just as staggered by her disappearance as was a lover. He telegraphed that she might perhaps be at the house of an old servant of their father's at Boston in Lincolnshire. But next day came a report dispatched from Boston that the good man and his wife had heard nothing of their late master's daughter. Again to Bridlington he sent Max to some friends there. But from that place came a similar response. Marianne was, like Maud, in hiding. But why? In the bright morning sunshine he strolled the streets, which were so full of quaint and interesting types. There in Belgrade, the gateway of the East, one saw the Servian peasant in his high boots, his white shirt worn outside his trousers, and his round high cap of astrakhan. The better-class peasant wore his brown homespun, while the women, with the gay-coloured kerchiefs on their heads, wore their heavy silver girdles and their ornaments reminiscent of the Turkish occupation. Big burly men in scarlet waistbands and fur caps, women in pretty peasant costumes from the distant provinces, officers gay with ribbons and crosses, and ladies in gowns and hats that spoke mutely of Bond Street and the Rue de la Paix, always seen in the ever-moving panorama of that cosmopolitan little capital where East meets West. The financial business which Charlie had come there to transact had already been concluded, to the mutual satisfaction of His Excellency the Prime Minister and of the grey-faced old misanthrope seated in the silent room in Park Lane. Many cables in cipher had been exchanged, and Charlie had placed his signature to half a dozen documents, which in due course would be countersigned with old Sam's Crawley calligraphy. The stake of Statham Brothers in Servia represented considerably over 1 million sterling, and nobody had been more conscious of old Sam's readiness to assist in the development of the country's rich resources than His Majesty the King. Upon a side table in Statham's study in Park Lane was a big autographed portrait in a silver frame, which King Peter had given him at his last audience. Therefore it was with feelings of gratification that Charlie heard from the Minister-President's lips the verbal message that the King had sent, a message of thanks to Mr. Rolfe for doing all that he had done to arrive at a satisfactory arrangement whereby, with English capital, Servia's wealth was to be exploited and work provided for her industrial population. Though he knew that Maud Petrovich was no longer in Belgrade, yet he still lingered on at the Grand Hotel amid all its clatter, its hustle, and its music. Truth to tell, he earnestly desired to obtain the truth from Sir Charles Harrison. For that dastardly attempt at top-shader, a friend of his was responsible. It was the identity of the friend in question that he was deeply anxious to establish, so that in future he would know whom to doubt and whom to trust. Was Max Barclay really his friend? Hour upon hour he reflected upon that problem. He recollected incidents which, in his present state of mind, filled him with misgivings. Why had he openly charged him with having been present at the house in Cromwell Road after the disappearance of the doctor and his daughter? Indeed, had he not practically charged him with opening the doctor's safe and abstracting its contents? He had not made the charge directly, it was true, but his remarks had certainly been made in a spirit of antagonistic suspicion. A long letter from Max explained the sudden disappearance of Marianne from Cunnington's and begged him to give all information regarding any likely quarter where the girl had sought refuge. It was now plain enough to Charlie that his sister had been discharged from the establishment in Oxford Street, and in disgrace. In what disgrace? When he read the letter in his room at the hotel, he crushed it in the hand with an imprecation upon his lips. Cunnington should answer to him for this indignity. He would compel the fellow to tell him the truth. His sister's honour was at stake. Disgraced by a sudden discharge, she had disappeared. She had, no doubt, been ashamed to face the man who loved her, ashamed too to write to her brother. Instead, she preferred to go away and efface herself, as, alas, so many London shop girls have done before her. Charlie Rolfe knew the cruelty practised by many a shopkeeper in London in discharging their female employees at a moment's notice. For a man, it matters little. Perhaps, indeed, it is best for both parties. But for a helpless girl without friends, without money, and without home to be cast suddenly upon the great world of London, filled as it is with lures and temptations, is a grave sin which no tradesman ought to commit. And yet there are today in London and its suburbs hundreds of smug, top-hatted, frock-coated tradesmen who, though pillars of their chapels and churches, and stalking around the aisles with their plush collecting bags on Sundays, will on 6 days in the week cast forth any poor girl in their employ without a grain of sympathy or compunction, merely because she may break a rule, or even because she does not lie to customer sufficiently well to induce him to make purchases. The general public are ignorant of the tyranny of shop life in London. There have been strikes quickly suppressed because, by lifting his finger, the employer is overwhelmed with assistants glad to live on a mere bread and butter wage, and those strikes have been treated humorously by the evening papers. Ah, the tragedy of it all! Charles Rolfe, though secretary and trusted factotum of a millionaire, knew it all. His sister had been in a snug billet, one from which he had fondly believed she could never have been dislodged. But the hard, bitter truth was now apparent. Even his own brotherly protection had availed nothing. She had been consigned to disgrace. It was with such bitter thoughts he resolved to return to London. He went to the telegraph office and sent a long message to Sam Statham, explanatory of what had occurred and beseeching his intervention with Cunnington. Through the night he waited, but received no response. Then he went round in the morning to bid Sir Charles adieu. "Well, Rolfe," exclaimed the representative of the British government, "I'm sorry you're off so quickly. My wife was asking you to dine tomorrow night. Usual weekly dinner, you know." "And have you discovered nothing regarding Petrovich?" asked Charlie quickly. "Well," replied the diplomat after a moment's hesitation, "to tell the truth, I have." "You have?" gasped the young man eagerly. "What?" The other knit his brows and was for a moment silent. Something, he said, "that is astounding. I cannot give it credence. It's all too amazing, too tragic, too utterly incomprehensible." The end of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux. Chapter 43. The Lost Beloved. Weeks had dragged by. To Max Barclay they had been weeks of keen anxiety and unceasing search to discover traces of his lost beloved. Once, and only once, had he seen Jean Adam, against whom Sam Statham had warned him. He had met the man of brilliant financial ideas by appointment at lunch at the Savoy, and had told him plainly that he had reconsidered the whole matter of the Turkish concession and had decided to have nothing to do with it. His excuse was lack of funds at that moment. To the old millionaire he owed a good deal for giving him the tip regarding the plausible Anglo-Frenchman. Adam, alias Adams, received Max's decision without the alteration of a muscle of his face. He was a perfect actor, and betrayed no sign of surprise or of chagrin. "Well, my dear fellow," he remarked, raising his glass of Braunberger and contemplating it before placing it to his lips, "you are losing the chance of a lifetime. If Baron Hirsch had been alive, he wouldn't have allowed such a thing to slip. When old Statham knows of it, he will move heaven and earth to come in." Max was silent. He did not allow his companion to know that Statham had been responsible for his refusal to join in the project. "I'm sorry too," he said, "but just now I'm rather pressed. I was hard hit last week over those Siberians." "But the money required is a mere bagatelle. I have mine already." "I regret," answered Max, "but my decision is final." "Very well, my dear fellow," replied Adam lightly. "I don't want to persuade you. There are 1,000 men in the city who will be ready to put up money tomorrow morning." And the pair finished their luncheon and parted, Adam, of course, entirely unsuspicious of the part Statham had played in upsetting his deeply laid plans. To every address which Marianne's brother had furnished, he had gone at post-haste, only to draw blank every time. Charlie had, at Statham's instructions, gone first to Constantinople, then to Odessa and Batum, after which he had returned direct to London. In Odessa he had been met by a special messenger from the London office bearing a number of documents, and his business in that city had occupied him nearly a fortnight. Therefore it was early in October when, arriving by the evening train at Charing Cross from Paris, he took a cab straight to Park Lane. In greeting him, old Sam was rather curious in his manner, he thought. There was a lack of cordiality. Usually when he came off a long journey, the old fellow ordered Levy to bring the decanter of whisky and a siphon. But on this occasion the head of the great financial house merely sat in his chair at his desk and heard his secretary's report without even suggesting that he might be fagged by his rush across Europe. Rolfe related, briefly and plainly, the various points upon which he had failed and those upon which he had been successful. Some of his decisions had brought many thousands of pounds into the already overflowing coffers of Statham Brothers, and yet the old man made no sign. He heard all without any comment, save now and then a grunt of satisfaction. The younger man could not disguise from himself the fact that the millionaire was not himself. His face was paler and more transparent, while the green-shaded electric lamp shed upon it a hue that was unreal and ghastly. Old Levy, too, as he flitted in and out like a white-breasted shadow, seemed to regard him with unusual suspicion and distrust. What could it all mean? He looked from one to the other in puzzled surprise. He was unaware that only on the previous night a thin, dark, bearded man had been ushered into the very room and had sat for 2 hours with the great financier. His countenance, his gestures, the cut of his clothes, all showed plainly that he was not English. Besides, the consultation was in French, a language which old Sam knew fairly well. The man was a spy, and he was from Belgrade. From the moment Charlie Rolfe had descended at the station to the moment he had left it, secret observation had been kept upon his movements, and to furnish their report to his master, the spy had travelled from Serbia to London. Samuel Statham trusted nobody. Even his most confidential assistant was spied upon, and his own reports compared with those of a spy's. More than once, as Charlie Rolfe, all unconscious of the surveillance upon him, related what had occurred in King Peter's capital, the old man smiled in disbelief. This younger man could not understand. He was in ignorance of the great conspiracy in progress or of the millionaire's ulterior motives. The old man's face was sphinx-like as it ever was, a countenance in which no single trait was visible, neither was there human joy or human sympathy. It was the face of a statue, the face of a man whose greed and avarice had rendered him pitiless. And yet, strangely enough, this very man was, to Charlie's knowledge, a philanthropist in secret, giving away thousands yearly to the deserving poor without any thought of laudatory comment of either press or public. Samuel Statham was not well. Of that Charlie felt assured. He noticed the slight trembling of the thin white hands, the fixed, anxious look in his eyes, the curl of the thin, grey lips, all of which caused him anxiety. In his ignorance, he had grown to be greatly fond of the eccentric old man who pulled so many of the financial wires of Europe and whose word could cause the stock markets to fluctuate. A scribbled word of his that night would be felt in Wall Street on the morrow, whilst the pulses of the bourses of Berlin, Paris, and Vienna were ready at any moment to respond instantly to the transactions of Statham Brothers, often so gigantic as to cause a sensation. Presently Sam Statham commenced his cross-questioning regarding the exact situation in Belgrade, the attitude of the minister-president, and the strength of the opposition in that wooden shed-like Parliament House, the Skupshina, of whom he had seen, and what information he had gathered regarding the tariff war with Austria. To all the questions, Charlie replied in a manner which showed him to be perfectly alive to all the requirements of the firm. To those in Old Broad Street City, secret information regarding the future policy of Serbia means a gain or loss of many thousands, and though during his sojourn in the city of the White Fortress his mind had been so perturbed over his own private affairs, he had certainly not neglected those of the great firm who employed him. The old man gave little sign of approbation, and after nearly an hour suddenly dismissed him abruptly, saying, "Very well. You're tired, I expect. You'd better go to dinner. I'll see you in the morning." "There is another matter I wanted to speak to you about," Charlie said, still remaining in his chair, watching the old fellow as he turned towards his desk and drew some papers onto his blotting pad. "Eh? What?" asked the old fellow sharply, turning again to the other. "You did very well in Odessa. I was very pleased to receive that last cable from you." Suvorov grew frightened evidently, afraid I should withdraw and let the whole business go into air, and he chuckled to himself in delight at how he had worsted a powerful Russian banker who was his enemy. "It was not of that I wished to speak," remarked Rolfe quietly. "It was with regard to my sister Marion." The old fellow started uneasily at his secretary's words. "Eh? Your sister?" he said. "What about her?" "She's left Cunnington's," Charlie said. "According to what I hear, she has been discharged in some disgrace." "Ah, yes," was the old man's response, as though recalling the fact. "I've heard so. Your friend Barclay came to see me and told me some long story about her. I wrote to Cunnington, but I haven't seen any reply from him. It may have gone to the office." "My sister has left Oxford Street and hidden herself in disgrace. We can't find her." "Then if you can't find her, Rolf, I don't see how I can assist you," remarked the elder man. "Girls entertain strange fancies, especially the sentimental-minded. Been reading novels, perhaps, eh? Was she given to that?" "The girls at Cunnington's have little time for reading," he said, piqued at Statham's careless manner. Hitherto he had believed that the old man was genuinely interested in her, but he now saw that her future was to him nothing. He was too much occupied in piling up wealth to trouble his head over a girl's distress, even though the girl might be the sister of the man who, by his acute business foresight, often won for him thousands in a single day. Charlie rose, full of suppressed anger. He did not notice a look of anxiety and shame upon the old man's face, for his head was bowed beneath the lamplight as he pretended to fumble with his papers. "Perhaps your sister was tired of the place. Too much hard work. Thought to better herself." "My sister was, like myself, much indebted to you, Mr. Statham," was Rolf's reply. "If she has been discharged in disgrace, it is, I feel confident, through no fault of her own. Therefore, I beg of you to ask fit Cunnington to make full inquiry." "What's the use? It is Cunnington himself who engages the hands and discharges them," replied Statham evasively. "I can't interfere." "But," Rolf argued, "for the sake of my sister's good name, you will surely do me this one small favor." "I've already seen Barclay, who says he is engaged to her. Call on him, and he'll explain what I've already said and the inquiry I've already made," replied the old man in growing impatience. "But weeks have gone by, and you have received no reply from Cunnington. He does not usually treat you with such discourtesy." "I can only think that he acted as his own judgment directed him," the millionaire replied. "You know how strict the rules are that govern shop assistants, and I suppose he could not favour your sister any more than the others." "Marianne wanted no favours," he declared. "She never asked one of anybody at Oxford Street. She only desires justice and truth, and I mean to have them for her." "Then go and see Cunnington for yourself," snapped the old man. "I've done all I can do. If your sister chooses to go away and hide herself, how can I help it?" "But she was sent away," cried Rolf in anger. "Sent away in disgrace, and I intend to discover what charge there is against her, and the truth concerning it." "Dear me, Rolf," snapped the old man impatiently. "Do go home, for heaven's sake. You're tired and hungry, consequently out of temper." "Yes," he cried, "I'm out of temper because you refuse to render my sister justice. But she shall have it. She shall." And he stalked out of the room and closed the door noisily behind him. Then, after the door was closed, old Sam raised his head, and his eyes followed the young man. In them was a look such as was seldom seen there, a look of double cunning which spoke mutely of false and double dealing. The end of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux. Chapter 44 tells of a determination. Entering his chambers in Jermyn Street half an hour later, Rolf was met by the faithful Green, to whom he gave orders to ring up Mr. Barclay at Dover Street. Then he went along to his room to wash and dress. A few moments later, Green came in, saying, "Mr. Barclay left town 5 days ago, sir. He is up at Kilmarnock." His master made no reply for some moments. Then at last he said, "Pack my suitcase and phone to Euston to reserve me a seat to Perth on the 10:05 tomorrow morning." "Yes, sir." "And to everybody, except my sister if she calls. You don't know where I've gone. You understand?" "Perfectly, sir." And the man set about packing up his master's traps. "You may as well put on a dinner coat. Max may have friends," Rolf said. "Very well, sir." His master dressed quickly and went alone to the club for a late dinner. Most of his friends were away shooting, therefore he idled alone for an hour over the paper and then returned to his chambers. Next morning he scribbled a hasty note to Mr. Statham, making an excuse for his sudden absence, and directly after 10 was seated in the Scotch Express travelling out of London. At 8 that evening he stepped out upon the big dark station at Perth, sent a telegram to the Crown Inn at Kilmarnock village for a machine, as a fly is called, and then took the slow branch line that runs a Crieff and skirts Loch Earn to the head of Glen Ogle, where lay the old castle and fine shooting of which Max Barclay was possessor. A drive of 3 miles on the road beside Loch Voyle brought him to the lodge gates, and then another mile up through the park he came to the great portico of the castle. It was nearly midnight. Lights were still in the billiard room of the fine old castellated mansion which Max's father had modernized and rendered so comfortable, and when Charlie rang, Burton, the butler, could not suppress an exclamation of surprise. In a few moments, however, Charlie burst into the room where Max and 5 other men were playing snooker before retiring. The host's surprise was great, but the visitor received a hearty welcome, and an hour later, when the guests had gone to their rooms, the 2 friends stood alone together in the long, old-fashioned drawing-room, which, without a woman's artistic hand to keep things in order, was rapidly going to decay. A big wood fire blazed cheerfully in the wide, old-fashioned grate, for October evenings in the Highlands are damp and chill, and as the 2 men stood before it, they looked at one another, both hesitating to speak. Across Charlie's mind flashed those suspicions which had oppressed him in Belgrade. Was the man before him his enemy or his friend? "Well," he blurted forth, "I've come straight up to see you, Max. I only arrived home last night. I want to see you concerning Marian." His companion's lips hardened. "Marian!" he exclaimed. "I've done all I can. I've left no effort untried. I've sought the aid of the best confidential inquiry agency in London, and all to no avail. She has disappeared as completely as Maud has done." "Yes, I know," replied her brother, thrusting his hands deep into the trouser pockets of his blue serge travelling suit. "I've seen Statham." "And so have I." "He wrote to Cunnington's, but the latter was not replied. I saw Cunnington myself." "And what did he say?" "The fellow refused to say anything," he replied in a hard tone. Silence again fell between the pair. The long, old-fashioned room, with its blue china, its chintz coverings, its grand piano, and its bowls of autumn roses, though full of quaint charm, was spared and unsuited to the home of a bachelor. Indeed, Kilmarnock was a white elephant to Max. He received a fair rental from the farms on the estate, but he never went near the place except for sport for 6 weeks or so each autumn. The old place possessed some bitter memories for him, for his mother died there quite suddenly of heart disease on the night of a large dinner party. He was only 18 then, but he remembered it too well. It was a tragic memory which had caused him to abandon the place, except when he invited a few of his friends to shoot over the estate. "Let's go into my room to talk," he suggested. "It's more cosy there." As a man hates all drawing rooms, so did Max Barclay detest his. It was for him full of recollections of his dear dead mother. And so they passed along the corridor to Max's own little den in the east wing of the house, a pleasant little room overlooking the deep, shady glen from whence rose the constant music of the ever-rippling burn. As Charlie sank into the big armchair near the fire, Max pushed the cigar box towards him. Then he seated himself, saying, "Now, old fellow, what are we to do? Marian must be found." "She must. But you have failed, you say." "Utterly," he sighed. "She was discharged from Cunnington's. Disgraced." "Why?" Max shrugged his shoulders. Both men knew well that the reason of the girl's disappearance was the shame of a dismissal. Both men knew also that by lifting his finger, Sam Statham could have reinstated her, or could at least have had inquiry made as to the truth of what had really occurred. But he had refused. Therefore both were indignant and angry. During the next half hour they discussed the matter fully and seriously, and were agreed upon one main point, that Statham had acted against them both in refusing his aid to clear the unfortunate girl. "Whatever fault she has committed," declared Max, "the truth should be told. I went to him, acknowledging my love for her and beseeching his aid, and yet he has refused." "Then let us combine, Max, in trying to discover the truth," her brother suggested. "Marian shall not be cast aside into oblivion by these stray drapery capitalists who gain fat profits upon the labour and lives of women." "You may imperil your position with Statham if you act without discretion," remarked Max warningly. "I shall do nothing without full consideration, depend upon it. Statham refused his assistance, therefore we must act for ourselves." "How? Where shall we begin?" asked Max. His friend raised his palms in a gesture of bewilderment. "Look here, Charlie," said the other in a confidential tone. "Has it not occurred to you that there may be a method in old Statham's eccentricity regarding that house of his? Now, tell me, what do you know of its interior? Let's be frank with each other. You have lost both your sister and the woman you adored, while I've lost Marian, my well-beloved. Let us act together. During these past weeks I've been thinking deeply regarding the mystery of that house in Park Lane, So have I, many times. I only know the ground floor and basement. I have never ascended the stairs through that white enamelled iron door concealed by the one of green baize. Where does old Levy sleep? In a room at the back of the kitchen, when he sleeps at all. He's like a watchdog, on the alert always for the slightest sound. Max paused for a moment before making any further remark. Then he said in a quiet voice, "There are some very queer stories afloat concerning that place, Charlie." "I know, I've heard them. About mysterious people who enter there at night and don't come forth again. But I don't believe them. Old Sam has earned a reputation for being eccentric, and his enemies have tacked on all sorts of sensational fictions. But I've heard lately from a half a dozen sources most extraordinary stories. Up at the Mortons at Inversnaid the night before last, they were talking of it at dinner. They were unaware that I knew Statham. Just as the gossips were unaware that the persons who come and go so mysteriously at the Park Lane mansion are secret agents of the great financier," Rolf said. "Of course, it would not do to say so openly, but that's who they are. The allegation that they don't come forth again is, I feel confident, mere embroidery to the tale." "But," exclaimed Max with some hesitation, "has it not ever occurred to you, somewhat curious, that, so deeply involved in Servian finance, Statham has never sought to solve the mystery of the doctor's disappearance? Remember, they knew each other. The doctor, when he was in power at Belgrade, was probably the old man's cat's paw. Is it not therefore surprising that he has never expressed a desire to seek out the truth?" Rolf held his breath as a new and terrible suspicion arose within him. He had never regarded the affair in that light. Was it possible that his master knew well all the circumstances which had led the doctor to disappear in that manner so extraordinary? Had he really had a hand in it? Was he the friend of whom Sir Charles had spoken in Belgrade? But no, he would not believe such a thing. Sam Statham was always honest in his dealings, or at least as honest as any millionaire can ever be. The man who habitually deals in colossal sums must now and then, of necessity, ruin his opponents and wreck the homes of honest men. And strange it is that the world is ever ungrateful. If a very wealthy man gave every penny of his profits to the poor, he would only be dubbed a fool or an idiot for his philanthropy. He recollected that afternoon when at work in old Sam's room, he had mentioned the doctor's sudden departure and how deftly the old man had turned the conversation into a different channel. Until 2 days ago, he would hear no word nor believe any ill against the man who had befriended him. But the man's refusal to assist him to discover the truth concerning the charge against Marianne, or to order her to be reinstated, had turned his heart. He was now Sam Statham's enemy. As before, he had been his friend. The two men, seated together, discussed the matter carefully and seriously for the greater part of the night, and when they had parted to go to their rooms, they took each other's hands in solemn compact. "We will investigate that house, Rolf," Max declared, "and we'll lay bare the mystery it conceals." The end of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux. Chapter 45. The Impending Blow. 4 nights later, Max and Charlie alighted from the Scotch Express at Euston on their return to London to make investigation. Next morning, Rolf went as usual to Park Lane and spent some hours attending to the old man's correspondence. The excuse Charlie made for his absence was that he had been away in an endeavour to find his sister, whereat the millionaire merely grunted in dissatisfaction. Both Charlie and Max were full of sorrow and anxiety on Marianne's behalf. What had befallen her they dreaded to guess. She had left Oxford Street, and from that moment had been swallowed in the bustling vortex of our great cruel London, the city where money alone is power, and where gold can purchase everything, even to the death of one's enemy. Perhaps the poor girl had met with some charitable woman who had taken her in and given her shelter, but more probable, alas, she was wandering hungry and homeless, afraid to face the shame of the dastardly charge against her, the charge that to neither her brother nor her lover none would name. That morning Charlie wrote on mechanically, speaking little, with the old man seated near him sucking the stump of a cheap cigar. His mind was too full of action he was about to execute, an action which in other circumstances would have indeed been culpable. Both he and his friend had carefully considered all ways and means by which they might enter those premises. To get in would be difficult. Old Levy bolted the heavy front door each night at 11 and then retired to his room in the basement, where he slept with one ear and his door open to catch the slightest sound. And even though they obtained access to the hall and study, there was a locked iron door at the head of the staircase, the door through which they must pass if their investigation of the house was to be made. That morning he made excuse to leave the old man seated in his study, saying that he wanted to speak to Levy and give him a message for one of the clerks from Old Broad Street. Outside the hall he sprang noiselessly up the stairs and, pulling open the baize-covered door, swiftly examined the great iron fireproof door so carefully concealed and secured. His heart failed when he recognized the impossibility of passing beyond. The door was enamelled white like the panelling up the stairs. Only over the small keyhole was a flap of shining brass bearing the name of a well-known safe-maker. An imminent peril of discovery by Levy, who often shuffled in noiseless slippers of felt, he lifted the flap and peered eagerly beyond. He could, however, see nothing. The hole did not penetrate the door. Then, fearing that he might be discovered, he slipped downstairs again and went to examine the front door. The bolts were long and heavy, and the chain was evidently in use every night. In the kitchen he found Levy preparing his master's frugal meal, which usually consisted of a small chop, a piece of stale bread, and one glass of light claret. His visit below gave him an opportunity of examining the fastenings of the windows. They were all patent ones, and besides, the whole were protected from burglars by iron bars. Patent fastenings were also upon the windows of the study looking forth upon Park Lane, while often at night the heavy oaken shutters were closed and barred. He had never before noticed how every precaution had been taken to exclude the unwelcome intruders. Through the whole morning his brain was actively at work to discover some means by which an entry might be effected, but there seemed none. The secret, whatever it might be, was certainly well guarded. He went across to the club to lunch and returned again at 3 o'clock. At 4 he rose, asking old Sam, who was seated writing, for a document from the safe, the key of which was upon his watch guard. The millionaire took out his watch and chain and handed them to his secretary, as he so often did, while the latter, crossing the room, opened the safe and fumbled about among some papers in one of the drawers. Then he relocked the safe, handed back the watch and chain, and reseated himself at the table. Those few brief moments had been all sufficient, for upon the bunch was the latchkey of the front door, an impression of which he had taken with the wax he had already prepared. The duplicate key could, he knew, be filed out of the handle of an old spoon, and such was his intention. He had hoped to find upon the bunch the key to the iron door in the stairs, but it was not among them. He knew each key by sight. The old man evidently kept it in a safe place, some place where the hand of none other might be placed upon it. Where did he keep it? Its hiding place must be somewhere handy, Charlie reflected, for at least half a dozen times a day the old man passed that iron barrier which shut off the upper part of the mansion. He wondered where he could find that key, but remained wondering. The evening he took the impression of the latchkey to Dover Street, and with Max's help tried to fashion a key to that pattern, but though they tried for hours, it was in vain. So they gave it up. Next day Max took train to Birmingham and handed the impression to a locksmith he chanced to know. The latter, having looked at it, shook his head and said, "This impression is no use, sir. It's what they call a paracentric lock, and you must have impressions of both sides, as well as the exact width back and front, before I can make you a duplicate." The man showed how the impression should be taken. Max, of course, concocting a story as to why it was wanted, and then back to London, he travelled that same night to consult with his friend. The outcome of this was that 2 days later complete impressions were taken of the small latchkey, and within 3 days came the duplicate by post. Max bought 2 electric torches, 2 pairs of felt slippers, a piece of thin but very strong rope, screwdriver, chisel, and other implements until he had a full burglar's equipment. The preparations were exciting during the next few days, yet when they came down to bedrock fact, there was that locked door which stood between them and the truth. Charlie's object in obtaining a duplicate latchkey was to enter noiselessly one night shortly before 11 and secrete themselves somewhere until Levy bolted the door and retired. They must take their chance by making any discovery they could. Both were well aware of Levy's vigilance and his quickness of hearing. Therefore, they would be compelled to work without noise, and also to guard against any hidden electric burglar alarms which might be secreted in the sashes of windows or in lintels of doors. Investigation by Charlie had not revealed the existence of any of these terrors to thieves, yet so many were the precautions against intruders that the least suspected contrivance for their detection was to be expected. Nearly a fortnight passed before all arrangements were complete for the nocturnal tour of investigation. Daily, Rolf, though attentive to his duties as the old man's secretary, was always on the alert to discover the existence of that key to the iron door. By all manner of devices, he endeavoured to compel Statham to unwittingly reveal its whereabouts. He made pretence of mistaking various keys to deed boxes and nests of drawers in order that the old man should produce other keys, but he was too wary, and never once did he fall into the trap. Yet often he left the study, passed up the stair, and through the door swiftly until the younger man began to suspect that it might be opened by means of some secret spring. Standing below, he could not obtain sight of the old fellow as he opened the door, and to follow him halfway up was too dangerous a proceeding. He had risked a good deal, but he dared not risk the old man's wrath in that. Still, that he passed the door quickly and without hindrance was plainly shown. He had a key secreted somewhere, a key which, when applied, turned quickly, with ease and without noise, to admit the owner of the great mansion to the apartments where his secret was so successfully hidden. Sometimes he would descend pale, haggard, and agitated, his hand upon his heart, as though to recover his breath. At others he was flushed and angry, like a man who had a moment before taken part in a heated discussion which had ended in a serious difference. Charlie watched all this and wondered. What secret could possibly be hidden in those upper stories that were at times so brilliantly lit? Each evening he called on Max at Dover Street, and with closed door so that the man should not hear, they discussed the situation. Of Jean Adam nothing further had been seen. Neither had the hunchback engineer, Leonard Lyle, been at all at evidence. Ever since Max had given the Frenchman his decision not to go to Constantinople, Adam had held aloof from him. They had parted perfectly good friends, but Max could detect the bitter chagrin that his reply had caused. One evening, as the two sat together, Charlie related his curious experience of the short, dark, good-looking girl who had met him in Paris and talked so strangely of Maud in the Tuileries Gardens. Max sat smoking his cigar, listening to every word. "Curious, very curious," he ejaculated. "Didn't she tell you her name?" "She gave it as Lorena." "Lorena?" gasped the other, starting up. "Lorena! Why, it must have been Lorena Lyle, old Lyle's daughter." "His daughter? I never knew he had one." "No, perhaps not. He doesn't often speak of her, I believe." "I saw her once, not long ago." "They have quarrelled, father and daughter," exclaimed Rolf, "and that accounts for her exposure of the plot against Statham to compel him to commit suicide rather than to face exposure. Remember, she would not betray who was Adam's associate in the matter, because it is her own father without a doubt. She alleged that Statham committed a secret crime by which he laid the foundation of his great fortune," Max remembered, "and further that confirmation of the charge brought by Adam will be found beyond that locked door." "Yes," said his companion in a low, hollow voice. "I see it all. The girl wishes to exclude her father from the business. Yet she knows more than she has told me." "No doubt. She probably knew Maud also, for she has lived for years, indeed nearly all her life, in Belgrade," Barclay remarked. "She quarrelled with her father and went on the stage as a dancer in the opera at Vienna. She is now in Paris in the same capacity. If I remember right, she was here at Covent Garden last season. They say she has great talent and that she is now being trained in Paris for the part of premier dancer. She alleged that there still lived two witnesses of Statham's crime, whatever it was," Charlie went on, "and they are probably Adam and a hunchback father, both men who have lived the life of the wilds beyond the fringe of civilization, both men who are as unscrupulous as they are adventurous. But from all I knew of Lyle, he was a most highly respectable person. In Belgrade they speak of him with greatest respect. Leonard Lyle in Belgrade, my dear chap, may have been a very different person to Leonard Lyle in other countries, you know," was his friend's reply. "But why has his daughter given me this warning, at the same time taking care to conceal her identity?" "She was a short, dark-haired girl, rather good-looking, except that top teeth protruded a little, about 19 or so, eh?" "Exactly. And depend upon it that she has warned you at Maud's request, in order that you may be forearmed against the blow which the pair are going to strike." "And which we, you and I, Max, are going to assist, eh?" added the other grimly. The end of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux. Chapter 46. To learn the truth. The mystery by which old Sam Statham sometimes passed beyond that white enamel door was inexplicable. Whenever he left the library to ascend the stairs, Charlie Rolfe stole quietly out behind him and listened. Sometimes he distinctly heard the key in the lock. At others, it sounded as though the closed door yielded to his touch and swung aside for him to pass beyond. It closed always with a thud, as though felt had been placed upon it to prevent any metallic clang. While Charlie watched the great financier's every movement, Max was unceasing in his inquiries regarding Marian. Advertisements had been published in the personal columns of various newspapers, and the private inquiry agents whose aid he had sought had been unremitting in their vigilance. The whole affair from beginning to end now showed the existence of some powerful hand which had directed and rendered the mystery beyond solution. The strange reappearance of Jean Adam and Leonard Lyle had been followed quickly by the extraordinary flight of Dr. Petrovich and Maud. The latter had, only an hour before she had disappeared into space, made some remarkable confession to Marian, a confession which might or might not save Samuel Statham from an ignominious death. But the girl had preserved the secret of the confession confided to her by a friend, and preferring shame and misjudgment, she in turn had disappeared, whither no one knew. The two men, brother and lover, who had now united their forces to solve the problem and at the same time ascertain for themselves what the secret of the house in Park Lane really was, were at their wits' ends. Their inquiries and their efforts always led them into a cul-de-sac. At every turn they seemed foiled and baffled. And was it surprising when it was considered the power of Samuel Statham and the means at his command for the preservation of a secret? Charlie felt that he was being watched hourly by one or other of those spies who sometimes gave such valuable information to the head of the firm. Some of these secret agents of Statham he knew by sight, but there were others unseen and unknown. Even though Max and his friend were able to enter unheard and secrete themselves before the place was locked up by old Levy, yet there was that wide door barring their passage to the mystery beyond. Many times they discussed the possibilities and each time hesitated. Charlie was sorely puzzled regarding the key of the iron door. Sometimes it was undoubtedly used, sometimes not. At last one evening, after both men had dined at the St. James's, of which Max was a member, they resolved upon a bold move. Charlie suggested it, and the other was at once ready and eager. So after Max had been round to his rooms to put on a suit of dark tweeds, he went to Charlie's chambers, where the various implements were produced and laid upon the table. It was then nearly 10 o'clock. Rolfe, having sent Green to the other end of Jermyn Street out of the way, drew out the whiskey decanter from the Tantalus stand, poured out 2 pecks with soda and drank. Success to the elucidation of old Statham's secret. Then, carefully stowing the various articles in their pockets, they slipped down into the street and were out of sight before the inquisitive Green had returned. Arrived in Park Lane, after a hasty walk, they strolled slowly along by the park railings past the house. All was in darkness save the hall, where the electric lamp showed above the fanlight. Old Sam was probably in his study smoking his last cigar, for the shutters were that night closed, as they sometimes were. The shutters of the basement were also closed behind their iron bars, while at the upstairs windows all the blinds were carefully drawn. Indeed, the exterior of the house presented nothing unusual. It was the same as any other mansion in Park Lane. Yet there were many who, on going up and down the thoroughfare afoot or in the motor buses, jerked their thumbs at it and whispered. The house had earned a reputation for mystery. Sam Statham was a mystery in himself, and of his house many weird things were alleged. Thrice the pair passed and repassed. At the corner of Deanery Street stood a constable, and while he remained there, it was injudicious to attempt an entry with a latchkey. So they strolled back in the direction of the fountain, conversing in undertones. Max glanced at his watch and found that it wanted 11:15. At last they crossed the road and passed the door. All seemed quiet. At that moment the only object in sight was a receding motor bus showing its red tail light. Not a soul was on the pavement. "All clear," cried Charlie, scarce above a whisper, as he slipped up the 2 or 3 steps, followed by his companion. That moment was an exciting one. Next second, however, the key was in the latch, and without a sound the wards of the lock were lifted. In another moment the pair stood within the brightly lit hall, and door was closed noiselessly behind them. Standing there within a few yards of the door of the library where from the smell of tobacco smoke it was evident that old Sam was taking his ease, they were in imminent risk of discovery. Besides, Levy had a habit of moving without sound in his old felt slippers and might at any moment appear up the stairs from the lower regions. Instinctively, Charlie glanced upstairs towards a locked door, but next second he motioned his companion to follow and stole on tiptoe over the thick Turkey carpets past a milliner's door and on into a kind of small conservatory which lay beyond the hall and was in darkness. Though leading from the room behind the library, it was a fairly good spot as a place of hiding, yet so vigilant was old Levy that the chances were he would come in there poking about ere he retired to rest. The two men stood together behind a bank of what had once been greenhouse plants, but all of them had died by neglect and want of water long ago. The range of pots and dried stalks still remained, forming an effectual barrier behind which they could conceal themselves. Through the long French window of the room adjoining the light shone, and Charlie, slowly creeping forward, peered within. Then he whispered to his friend, and both men bent to see what was transpiring. The scene was unusual. A full view of the library could be obtained from where they stood in the darkness. In the room, two of the big armchairs had been pulled up with a small coffee table between them. On one side was old Sam, lazily smoking one of his big cigars, while in the other was Levy, lying back, his legs stretched out, smoking with perfect equanimity and equally with his master. Upon the table was a decanter of whisky and 2 glasses, and judging from the amused countenances of both men, Sam had been relating to Levy something which struck the other as humorous. It was curious, to say the least, that Levy, the humble, even cringing servant, should place himself upon an equality with his master. That he was devoted to old Sam, Charlie knew well, but this friendship he had never suspected. There was a hidden reason for it all, without a doubt. The two intruders watched with bated breath, neither daring to make a sound. They saw Levy, his cigar stuck in the side of his mouth, lean back and thrust his hands deep into his trouser pockets, uttering some words which they could not catch. His manner had changed, and so had Sam's. From gay, the pair had suddenly grown grave. Upon the millionaire's brow was a dark shadow such as Charlie, who knew him intimately in all his moods, had seldom seen there. Levy was speaking quickly. His attitude changed, as though giving serious advice, to which his master listened with knit brows and deep attention. Then, with a suddenness that caused the two watchers to start, the electric bell at the hall door sounded. In an instant Levy tossed his cigar into the fire, whipped off his glass from the table, and in a single instant became the grave family servant again, as with a quick gesture of his hand he left the room to answer the summons at the door. In a few moments he returned, closing the door quickly after him, so that whoever was in the hall could not overhear what was said. Approaching his master, he made some announcement in a whisper, whereat the millionaire clenched his fist and struck violently in the air. Levy urged calmness, that was evident from his manner. Then Sam, with a resigned air, shrugged his shoulders, paced the room in quick agitation, and turned upon his servant with his eyes flashing with anger. Again Levy placed his thin hand on the old man's arm, which calmed him into almost instant submission. Then the grave-faced old servant went out, and an instant later ushered in a woman, all in black, a woman who in an instant both Max and Charlie recognized. They both stood watching, breathless, rooted to the spot. The mystery, as they afterwards discovered, was even greater than they had ever anticipated. It was beyond human credence. The end of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux. Chapter 47 contains more mystery. The old-fashioned, ill-cut gown of black stuff and the rather unbecoming big black hat gave Sam's visitor an appearance of being older than she really was. A spotted veil concealed the features, but as she entered the room she raised it quickly. The face revealed was a soft, sweet countenance of Maud Petrovich. Charlie gripped his companion's arm and gave vent to an exclamation of amazement as he stood peering forth open-mouthed. As the girl entered, the old man turned fiercely upon her and uttered some inquiry. What it was the watchers could not distinguish, for a thick plate glass stood between the conservatory and the library. Yet whatever he said, or however caustic and bitter his manner, the young girl stood defiant. Her chin was raised, her eyes flashed upon him, and a gloved hand was outstretched in a gesture of calm denunciation as she replied with some words that caused the old fellow to draw back in surprise and confusion. The door had closed, for Livy had left the pair together. Max wondered whether the old servant would now come and search the back premises prior to locking up. If so, they might easily be discovered. Those felt-soled boots of old Livy struck fear into their hearts. Charlie was, however, too occupied in watching the old man and the girl at that moment to think of any danger of detection. His well-beloved stood pale, beautiful, and yet defiant before the man who a moment before had shaken his fist and clenched his teeth on hearing of a demand to see him. The words she had uttered had caused an instant change in his manner. His sudden anger had been succeeded by fear. Whatever she had said was evidently straight to the point. For a moment he regarded her in silence, then over his grey face came a crafty smile as with mock courtesy he offered her a chair, still remaining standing himself. She leaned her elbow on the arm of the chair and bending towards him was speaking again, uttering slow, decisive words, each of which seemed to bite into his very soul. His countenance again changed. From mock humour it became hard, drawn, almost haggard. Charlie, who knew the old man in every mood, had never witnessed such an expression upon his face. Beneath it all, however, he had detected a look of unrelenting, almost fiendish revenge. He longed to rush forward and grasp his loved one in his arms, but Max, seeing his agitation, laid his hand firmly upon his shoulder. "Let us watch in patience, Charlie," he urged. "We may learn something interesting." Maud had altered but little since that afternoon when, in the haze of the red London sunset, Charlie had last walked with her in Nevern Square. She was perhaps a trifle pinched in the cheeks, but the sweet dimples were still there, and the little wisp of hair still strayed across her white brow. Her gown, however, seemed shabby and ill-fitting. Perhaps she had borrowed it in order to come there in garments by which she would not be recognized. For a young girl to make a visit at that late hour was, to say the least, somewhat unusual. Both men standing in the shadow behind the thick glass longed to hear what the pair were saying. It was tantalizing to be so near the disclosure of a secret, indeed to have it enacted before one's eyes, and yet be debarred from learning the truth. Max examined the door, hoping to open it ever so slightly, but to his chagrin he found it locked and bolted. Old Livy had already prepared to retire before they had made their surreptitious entrance there. That he had at last found Maud again was to both a source of immense gratification. At last the truth of the doctor's strange disappearance would now be known. But what connection would old Statham have with the affair? Charlie recollected what Sir Charles Harrison had told him in Belgrade, that the bomb outrage by which a poor innocent child had lost her life had been planned by one of his friends. He had suspected Max, but in the light of Maud's secret visit to Statham, he now held the last named in distinct suspicion. Was it part of the millionaire's cunning policy in Servia to rid the country of its greatest statesman? No, that was impossible. The doctor and Statham had been friends. When Petrovich was in power, they had worked hand in glove, with the result that the millionaire had lent money to the Servian government upon very second-class security. Unrest in Servia would, Charlie was well aware, mean loss to Statham brothers of perhaps £1 million sterling. It was therefore to the interest of the firm that the present government should remain in power, and that the country should be allowed to develop and progress peacefully. He tried to put behind him that increasing suspicion that old Sam was a friend to whom the diplomat had so mysteriously referred. And yet, as he watched every movement, every gesture of the pair within that long room where the lights were so artistically shaded, the room wherein deals involving the loss or gain of hundreds of thousands of pounds were decided, he saw that the girl remained still defiant, and that the man stood vanquished by her slow, deliberate accusation. Old Sam's bony fingers were twitching, a sign of suppressed wrath which his secretary knew well. He held his thin lower lip between his yellow teeth, and standing with his back to the fireplace, he now and then cast a supercilious smile upon the pretty girl who had come there in defiance of the convenances, in defiance evidently of his own imperious commands. Samuel Statham at that moment was not the hard-faced old benefactor who haunted the seats in the parks and gave so much money anonymously to the deserving among the submerged tenth. He was a man fighting for his honour, his reputation, his gold, nay, his very life. He was a man whose keen wit was now pitted against that of a clear, level-headed girl, one who had right and justice on her side. Was it possible, Charlie thought, that his well-beloved knew the old man's secret, that secret which before he would face its exposure, He would prefer the grave itself. He watched Maud and noted how balanced was her beautiful countenance, and yet how calm and how determined she was. When the old man spoke, she listened with attention, but her replies, brief and pointed, were always made with a gesture and expression of triumph, as of one who knew the naked and astounding truth. "What can it all mean?" whispered Max. "Why is she here? How tantalizing it is that we cannot catch a single word she is uttering." "That door's bolted," Charlie said in a tone of chagrin. "We can only watch. See, she is evidently telling him some home truths that are the reverse of palatable. He looks as though he could kill her." "He'd better not attempt it," remarked Max grimly, and they both stood again in silence, peering forward in breathless eagerness. For fully 10 minutes longer the old man and the young girl were in heated discussion. Sometimes Statham spoke quickly and angrily, with that caustic assertiveness that most people found so overbearing. Of a sudden both watchers were aware of a slow, stealthy movement behind them, a shuffling of feet it seemed. It was old Levy on his tour of inspection to reassure himself that all was secure. In an instant both intruders drew back into the deep shadow behind a high stand upon which stood choice plants and tears, or rather the dried up pots which had once contained them. They were only just in time, for old Levy, peering forth into the semi-darkness as he stood in the doorway leading from the hall, searched around. Then, finding all quiet and detecting nobody, he closed the door and locked it. They were thus locked out by both doors. To re-enter the house would be difficult. It was a contingency for which they had not prepared. Still, they were too interested in watching the pair within to think much of the contretemps that had occurred. Old Levy had shuffled away and was waiting, no doubt, to usher out the dainty little visitor before returning to the regions below. Maud, however, showed no sign of haste to leave. Comfortably ensconced in a chair, with the veil thrown back, she sat facing him and replying without hesitation to his allegations. The sinister expression upon the old man's face told its own tale. His impatient bearing and quick gesture showed his eagerness to get rid of her. But she, on her part, seemed to have no intention of leaving just yet. She was speaking, her gloved finger raised to emphasize her words, hard words which, from the expression upon her face, seemed full of bitter sarcasm and reproach. Of a sudden, he turned upon the girl with a fierceness which took her by surprise. He uttered a few words which she answered quickly. Then, striking his hands into the pockets of his trousers, he bent towards her with an evil grin upon his grey face and made some remarks which caused in her a quick change of attitude. She rose from her chair, her face aflame with anger, and taking a couple of paces towards him, replied with a vehemence which neither of the unseen onlookers suspected. The battle of words continued. He was making some allegations, the truth of which she was denying. This girl, not yet out of her teens, was defiant of the man whose life had been one long struggle to grow rich and whose gigantic wealth was now crushing the very soul from his body. Surely they were an incongruous pair. His defiance of her was only a half-hearted one. His sarcasm had irritated her, and now alleging something which was a lie, he had goaded her into all the fierce ebullition of anger which a woman, however calm and level-headed she may be, cannot at times restrain. "I wonder what the old blackguard has said," whispered Max to the man at his side. "It seems as though he has made some charge against her." "Or against her father," Max suggested. "You suspected me of being privy to the doctor's disappearance, Max," Charlie said, still in a whisper. "You said that you saw me at the Cromwell Road that night. Are you still of that opinion?" "No," responded his friend. "There was a plot, a cleverly devised plot. Someone went there dressed exactly like you." "But you say you saw his face." "So I did, and I could have sworn it was you." "It is that conspiracy which we have to fathom," Charlie said. "At least we have established the fact that Maud is alive, and having found Maud, we may also find Marian. Possibly she went to her in safe hiding from us." "More than possible, I think." But while they were whispering, something occurred which made them both start. The girl, crimson with anger, suddenly dived her hand into her dress pocket and, taking out a bundle of paper, flung it at the man before her. They saw to their amazement that it was a bunch of crisp banknotes. She had cast it at his feet in open defiance. Perhaps the money was the price of her silence, money he had sent to her or to her father to purchase secrecy. The old man gave a glance at the notes crushed into a bundle and lying upon the carpet, and then turning to her, snapped his bony finger and thumb in defiance, and laughed in her face, a grim, evil laugh which Charlie knew from experience meant retaliation and bitter vengeance. The end of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux. Chapter 48. Not counting the cost. The girl turned to leave, but the old man placed himself between her and the door. She stamped a little foot angrily in command to be allowed to pass. He saw her determination and hesitated. Then he seemed to commence to argue, to place before her the probable result of her action in casting aside the money, but she would hear nothing. Her mind seemed fully made up. She had spoken a last word and wished to leave him. He saw in her decision an attitude antagonistic to himself. He was in deadly peril. Though his wealth could command all that was good and all that was bad, though it placed him above his fellow men and rendered him immune from much, yet it could not ensure her goodwill. Both Max and Charlie realized plainly that Maud was in possession of some great secret, and that she had refused a bribe of silence. This man, who had believed that his money could purchase anything, had discovered, to his dismay, that it could not seal her lips. He saw himself facing an imminent peril and was undecided how to act. He argued, but she would not listen. He appealed, but she only smiled and shook her head. Her mind was made up. She had decided to refuse the money. He picked it from the floor and handed it to her again, but she would not take it in her hand. Then he crossed to his writing table, took out his checkbook, and scribbled a check, one of a large amount in all probability. Tearing it from its counterfoil, he gave it to her. But with an expression of defiance, she tore it into four and cast it upon the floor with a gesture of disgust. And in triumph, before he could prevent her, she opened the door and disappeared from the room. "We must follow her," whispered Charlie eagerly. "But, my dear fellow, we can't. We are locked in." Rolf, realizing the truth that they were prevented from overtaking his well-beloved, for whom they had been so long in active search, and that she must again dip from them into oblivion, gave vent to a forcible expression of despair. "Let's remain here," urged Max. "We may learn something else." "The old man will go to bed," was Charlie's response, "and we will follow and explore above." "How?" asked Rolf. "That remains to be seen. We must in this case act discreetly and trust to luck." "But Maud, I must see her." "That's impossible at present." "You have seen her. That's enough for tonight. Tomorrow we may discover something further, or even tonight." Both men, scarce daring to breathe, were watching old Sam. After the girl had gone, he placed his hand upon his heart, and with face white and haggard, he sank into his writing chair. He had collapsed as though he had received a sudden blow. Levy entered hurriedly a few moments later, and finding his master leaning forward upon his table, muttering to himself, tried to rouse him. A glance at his face showed that he had collapsed. Levy therefore rushed across the room, poured out some brandy from the tantalus, and compelled the old man to swallow it. This, after a few moments, revived him. The faithful servant, however, stood by in wonderment. He seemed puzzled as to what had occurred. But the fragments of the torn cheque scattered upon the carpet showed defiance on the part of the visitor whom he had just shown out into the night. Levy stooped as far as his rheumatism would allow, and slowly, very slowly, gathered up the torn pieces of paper and placed them in the basket, his eyes the whole time upon his master. Straightening himself again, he spoke, making inquiry as to what had occurred. But his master, with a wave of his hand, commanded his silence. Then, slinking back to his chair, he remained, staring straight before him like a man in a dream. He seemed peering into the future, and he saw only exposure and ruin. Hands and teeth were clenched, for he realized that he had taken a false step. He had misjudged his own power and influence. He had believed that a good and truthful woman could be purchased as he might purchase any other thing or chattel. She had cast his gold into his face. He had insulted him, for she had spoken a truth which he could not deny. Indeed, that slim, pale-faced girl, scarce more than a child, held over him power supreme, power for life or for death. The scene within that room was a strange one. Old Levy, standing statuesque at his master's side, uttered some words, but the millionaire was silent. He only raised his grey head and sat staring at the great painting opposite, staring like a man peering into the grim unknown. The door that divided the watchers from the watched prevented the words from being overheard. The thickness of its glass prevented the truth being known to the two men standing breathless behind it. Had it been ordinary glass, they would no doubt have overheard the conversation between the old man and his fair visitor. The anger of both men had been aroused by Statham's attitude towards a girl. Even Charlie, faithful and devoted as he had been to the millionaire, had now become fiercely antagonistic, for he had seen by the old man's countenance that some terrible revenge was intended upon the girl he loved so dearly. Levy bent and placed his hand tenderly upon his master's shoulder, but Statham shook him off and, straightening himself, staggered to his feet and paced the room in a frenzy of despair. Charlie recollected his agitation after the unexpected discovery of Jean Adam lounging outside the park railings. This repetition of his apprehension showed him to be in terror of exposure and denunciation. Maud, so slim, sweet-faced, and innocent, had defied him. She had held him, the man whose power in every European capital was recognized and feared, in the hollow of her hand. Why? Aye, to that question there was no answer. They had witnessed a scene, but they had caught no sound of one single word. At last Levy succeeded in calming his master. He mixed him another brandy and soda and handed it to him. The old man seized it with unsteady hand and tossed it off at a single gulp. Then he walked slowly from the room, followed by Levy. An instant later the old servant turned the switch, and the room and with it the neglected conservatory were plunged in darkness. The two intruders listened. Voices sounded and then died away. A moment later they heard a thud and knew that the old man had passed beyond the white enamelled door and had closed it behind him. For another few minutes they remained in silence. Then Max whispered, "What shall we do?" "We must get out of here," answered his friend promptly. "We are caught like a rat in a trap. To open either of the doors leading to the house is impossible. We must try and make our exit by the back." And groping his way, he moved to the door, which opened onto a small paved backyard. But it had been secured. Levy indeed kept it always locked, and the key was not there. "To break open this will create a noise and arouse somebody," Max remarked. "Well, we must get out at all hazards. We can't stay here till morning and court discovery," Rolf argued. "If we only had a little light, we might see what we are doing." "By Jove, you've got a pocket lamp, Max. Where is it?" "Is it safe yet to show a light?" Barclay asked dubiously. "It may be seen from outside, you know." "It can't. There's a blank wall opposite." "But will not the reflection be seen by Levy from below?" asked Max. Rolf saw that, after all, there was some danger of detection, and admitted it. "Then let's wait a bit," his companion whispered. "By patience we may be able to escape without detection. Don't let us act indiscreetly." So the pair, leaning against one of the stands of dead flowers, waited in silence, their ears strained to catch every sound. The moments seemed hours, until at last, all being quiet, Max, at his friend's suggestion, pressed the electric button of the little hand lamp and showed a light upon the door. It was half of glass with strong lock and double bolts. To escape meant to break away a hole large enough for a man's body to pass. Max suggested that they might find the key hanging somewhere upon a nail, as conservatory keys are often kept in that manner. But though they searched the whole place, treading lightly as they went, they were unable to discover it. "Levy keeps it upon his bunch, I expect," Charlie remarked. "I've never seen this door open in my life." "That's why the flowers are all dead, perhaps," Max remarked grimly with a low laugh. Flowers. Old Sam declared that they were no use to him. Therefore he forbade Levy to give them any water, and they all died. The old man isn't fond of flowers. Says they're only useful at weddings and funerals. "There won't be many at his obsequies," laughed Max beneath his breath as he made another examination of the door. Both agreed that to open it was impossible, while to break out the glass was far too risky a proceeding, for some of it must fall upon the paving outside. Rain had begun to fall, pattering heavily upon the glass roof above, and as they were both searching about blindly for some other mode of egress, Max suddenly exclaimed, "Why, look here!" and pointed to a portion of the glass side of the conservatory which had opened outwardly upon a hinge, but which had been securely screwed up. "Excellent!" cried Charlie, realizing that an exit lay there, and quickly drawing from his pocket a serviceable-looking screwdriver, set to work upon the screws. They were long and hard to withdraw, but 10 minutes later all 6 of them were taken out, and pushing back the movable frame upon its hinges, they found themselves outside in the narrow backyard. Once free, Max turned his face upwards to the dark windows of the first floor of the mysterious mansion, saying, "We must get up there, Charlie, somehow or other." I'm not going from this place until I've learned the secret." "No," responded his friend. "Neither am I." The end of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux. Chapter 49. What lay behind the door? Above the dome-shaped roof of the conservatory was a row of 4 long, dark windows, and still above them 2 further stories. On the second story in the center of the house was a high window covered with wire network, evidently a staircase window of stained glass. The whole place was in darkness, as were the houses on either side, while at rear of them rose a blank wall, the back one of the houses in Park Street. The only light showing was in the basement, a faint glimmer behind the green Holland blinds, which showed the presence of Levy in the lower regions. "He sleeps in the front," remarked Charlie. "I expect, however, he keeps this on all night." "Where is old Sam sleep?" "That I don't know. We'll have to discover." The windows above the conservatory were their objective, but to ascend there was full of peril, for even though they could climb up, one false step and they could come crashing through the glass roof. This would mean both serious personal injury as well as instant discovery. In the whispered consultation that followed, both recognized the danger, but both were equally determined to risk it. They had plenty of time. The night was still young, therefore there was no need for haste. They made careful examination as far as they could in the very faint light. Max was afraid to flash his electric lamp too often, lest the attention of any neighbor might be attracted and an alarm of burglars given. Neither knew whether a servant might not be looking out upon the night. The house they desired to enter had earned a reputation as a house of mystery. Therefore it was more than likely that some watchful eye of a curious neighbor, master or servant, was kept upon the rear of the premises. At last Max, who was the more athletic and nimble of the two, decided that the only way by which to reach the roof of the conservatory was by the spouting at the side. The ascent was a difficult one, but he resolved to attempt it. Taking a small coil of thin but very strong rope which Charlie produced from the capacious pocket of the shooting jacket he wore for that purpose, he mounted upon his friend's shoulders and then climbed slowly up with an agility which surprised his friend. Once upon the roof, he made fast the rope to one of the iron stays of the spouting and let it down to Charlie, who a few moments later swarmed up it and stood on the edge of the glass roof beside his companion. Their position there was one of greatest peril. They stood together upon the narrow edging of lead by which the glass roof was joined to the wall of the house. They moved slowly and gingerly, for it was quite uncertain whether it would bear their weight. Besides, there was nothing to grasp by which to relieve their weight, for above them rose a wall sheer to the ledges of the row of windows, too high for them to reach. A step in the wrong direction, and down they must come with a crash into the neglected conservatory. Max could hear his own heart beating. The risk was greater than he had ever anticipated. Yet so greatly was their curiosity now aroused that nothing could brook their attempt to learn the secret that dark, mysterious house contained. They stood together, not daring to move. At a short distance away was a thin iron support running into the wall, part of the framework of the roof, and towards that Max crept carefully until at last he reached it and stood in a safer position. The weight of both men caused the curved roof to give slightly, and more than once they heard sharp noises where the glass, fitting too tightly, cracked across by the undue pressure. Neither spoke. Max was eagerly searching for some means by which to reach one of the windows above. In his ascent there he had torn his coat, and a great strip of it was hanging. He had left his head below, and the light rain was falling upon his uncovered head. Slowly he crept forward from iron to iron until he reached the opposite side of the big glass roof, and there found, as he had hoped, another iron rain-spout which led straight up past the end window to the roof of the house. Back he came to his companion in order to obtain the rope, and then, with it bulging in his pocket, he stole along and ascended the second pipe as he had done the first. This proceeding was, however, far more dangerous, for to fall with the glass beneath him meant almost certain death. Charlie watched his form ascending in the darkness, scarce daring to breathe. Slowly he went up, until on a level with the window he halted. Around the ledge, 6 inches above, was an iron bar let into the wall in order to prevent flower pots from being blown down upon the conservatory roof. This iron proved Max's salvation, for gripping it, he steadied himself while he secured the rope to the spout as he had previously done on the first ascent. Then, with a firm grip upon the strong bar and his knee upon the stone ledge, he tried the window. It was fastened. The green Holland blind was drawn, but as far as he could ascertain, the shutters were not closed. From his pocket he drew a glazier's putty knife, and inserting it between the sashes, worked quietly until his heart gave a bound of satisfaction at feeling the latch slowly give. A second later it went back with a sharp snap, and the window was free. He lifted the sash, pushed the blind aside, and crept within. Then, leaning forth, he whispered to Charlie to follow. Up the ladder came by means of the rope as quickly as he was able, and a few moments later both men stood within the room. By its sound, and by the fact that it was carpetless, they knew it was devoid of furniture. Max flashed on the light, and the truth was at once made plain. The apartment was square and of fair size, but within was not a single thing, was perfectly empty. In a second a thought occurred to Charlie. "If the door's locked on the outside, we are done," he gasped. They both crossed to the door in an instant, and Max placed his hand upon it. The handle turned slowly, and the door yielded. By great good fortune it was not locked. Creeping noiselessly outside, they found themselves upon a big square landing above half a dozen broad stairs. Below them was a white enamelled iron door, which opened only to its owner, and which no person had been known to pass. The landing and stairs were thickly carpeted, just as they were below the door. But above the place was a close, musty smell of a house that for years had remained closed and neglected. From the landing were 3 other doors beside the one at which they stood, all of them closed. Charlie took his bearings, and pointing to the door farthest away from them, whispered, "That's the drawing room, no doubt. And that's the door of the room adjoining. I expect it's a big room opening from back to front like all drawing rooms in these houses." "Awkward if it proves to be the old man's bedroom," Max replied with a laugh. "We must risk that. My own belief is that he sleeps up on the next floor." "These are all reception rooms, without a doubt," was Charlie's answer. It was strange, after all the time he had been in the old man's employ, that this should be the first occasion he should explore the house. Those moments of pitch darkness were exciting ones. They resolved to enter the door furthest away, the door which they believed led to the drawing room, and together they moved noiselessly across with that purpose. The key was in the lock. Without noise, Max turned it and slowly pushed open the door. Both entered, holding their breath and fearing to make the slightest sound, for they knew not whether old Sam was asleep there. For a full 10 minutes they paused, listening for sounds of breathing in the pitch darkness. But there were none, only the beating of their own hearts. Then, with Charlie's whispered consent, Max pressed the button of the pocket lamp, and it shed a streak of light across to the opposite wall of the big apartment. What was revealed held them aghast and amazed. "This is indeed strange," gasped Charlie. "What can it be?" Max was turning the light from side to side of the room, examining every corner. What they saw had held them both speechless. Charlie saw an electric switch near his hand and touched it. In an instant the great room was flooded with light, revealing a scene curious, unusual, extraordinary. There was no thick carpet or upholstered furniture, no painted ceiling or pictures upon the walls, no cabinet or bric-a-brac or grand piano or palms or anything connected with drawing-room furniture. Instead, the two intruders found themselves inside a peasant's cottage in some far-off country, a house, it seemed, with quaint furniture painted and carved. Before them was an old-fashioned oak press, black with smoke and age, and along the wall a row of shining cooking utensils of copper. In the center was a long old table with big high-backed wooden chairs, at the side a high brick stove. The men stepped within and gazed around bewildered. At one end was a small square window, where beyond lay a snow-clad scene lit by the moon's rays, a cleverly contrived piece of scenery showing the white road winding into the distance, lined on each side by the dark forest of firs. The scene was intended to be Russian, without a doubt, for over the stove a holy icon hung against the wall, a small painted head surrounded by a square of highly burnished gold. Every object was quaintly shaped and foreign. In one corner stood an old spinning wheel with flags upon it, while in another was an old-fashioned gun. A couple of wolf skins were spread upon the floor, while upon the cleanly scrubbed table showed a large brown stain. It might be of coffee, or it might be of blood. The walls had been whitewashed, and across the ceiling, once gilt and adorned no doubt, ran blackened beams in exact imitation, it seemed, of some house in the far east of Russia beyond the Volga. Upon a side table lay a big, rather thin book, bearing upon its black, greasy cover the Imperial Russian arms, the double-headed eagle. Charlie opened it and found it ruled like an attendance book, with careful entries in Russian in various hands. Neither could read the language, therefore it was to them unintelligible. By the stove was a low wooden settle, upon which lay a man's fur cap and big sheepskin winter coat, as though the owner of the place had just risen and left. "What can this possibly mean?" asked Max, gazing around in sheer wonderment. To this query, however, Charlie could venture no suggestion. They stood amid surroundings that were to both a complete mystery. Charlie touched the switch when, lo, the lights in the room were extinguished, and only a line of white brilliance, as that of the full moon entering the window from the snow-covered land beyond, fell across a silent place, full upon the table, which bore that ugly dark brown stain. Both men stood motionless and wondering, fascinated by the extraordinary and striking effect. Was that stain shown so vividly beneath the white moonbeams actually the stain of blood? The end of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux. Chapter 50. Face to Face. That a Park Lane drawing room should be transformed into the interior of a log-built house of the Russian steppe was surely unsuspected by any of those who passed up and down that renowned thoroughfare every day. The popular idea associated that long row of millionaires' houses facing Hyde Park with luxuriant saloons, priceless paintings, old Persian carpets, and exquisite furniture. Who would believe that behind those windows with their well-kept curtains and brise of silk and lace was a room arranged with such care, with a snowy road and moonlight shone beyond the false window? "With what object, I wonder, is all this?" asked Charlie, speaking in an undertone as though to himself. There was something weird and uncanny about the scene, with that white streak of brilliance falling like a bar across the place, an indescribable something which made it plain that all had been arranged with some evil design by the old man. No second glance was needed to show that every bit of furniture and every article in the place was genuine. They were no stage properties, but real things brought from some far distant spot in eastern Russia. But with what motive? Aye, that was a question. They had turned and were about to withdraw from the place, Max leading the way, when suddenly he halted, for his quick ears caught some sound. It was a curious, low, whirring noise, followed almost instantly by a swift swish close to him, so near indeed that it caused a current of air in his face as some object passed him from above. At the same moment the noise of the mechanism ceased. For a few seconds both intruders hesitated. Charlie asked breathlessly what it could be, whereupon his friend turned on the light, and the truth stood revealed. By an ace he had escaped with his life. At the door, in order to prevent the egress of any intruder, a cunning but dastardly mechanical device had been placed. A long iron lever, to which was attached a keen-edged Japanese cutlass, had come forth from its hiding place in the lintel of the door, and descending with terrific force had only just escaped cutting Max down. Both men saw the means by which old Statham guarded the secret of that room, and shuddered. To enter was easy, but it was intended that he who entered might not emerge alive. Apparently one of the floorboards just within the door was loose, and being trodden upon, the weight released a spring or mechanism, and the razor-edged cutlass shot forth with murderous force. "By Jove!" gasped Charlie. "I had no idea the old man set traps for the unwary. We'd better be careful." "Yes, that was indeed a narrow escape," whispered Max. "It would have been certain death. Let's get out of it." The steel lever was down, the point of the cutlass touching the floor. Therefore they were both compelled to step over the death trap in order to leave the remarkable apartment. Then with careful hands Charlie tried the next door. It was locked. Brief examination showed it to be the door of the back drawing room, which had been thrown into the larger room with the mysterious purpose of constructing that striking rural interior. So they crossed to the third door on the opposite side of the landing, and with greatest caution, lest another pitfall should lurk there, opened it. The night of investigation was full of surprises. The instant Max flashed on his light, The pair drew back with low exclamation of horror. The small apartment was unfurnished. It contained only one object, gruesome and unexpected. In the center of the place, upon the black trestles, stood a coffin of polished oak with shining electro handles and fittings. The lid, they noticed, was screwed on. Was it possible that it contained an unburied corpse? Did that white enamel door upon the stairs conceal from the world the evidence of a crime? For a moment both men stood in that bare, uncarpeted room, rooted to the spot. The secret of Sam Statham stood revealed. Then, with a sudden effort, Charlie crept forward nearer the coffin and read upon its plate the words plainly engraved, Gene Adam, aged 49. Then Adam had been entrapped there and had lost his life. Both men started as the tragic truth dawned upon them. Adam was old Sam's most bitter enemy. He was dead, in his coffin. Yet the millionaire had, up to the present, been unable to dispose of the remains. There was no medical certificate, therefore burial was impossible. The weird stories which both men had heard of nocturnal visitors to that house who had never been seen to emerge, and of long boxes like coffins which more than one person said they had seen being brought out and loaded upon four-wheeled cabs, all now flashed across their mind. Of a verity that house was a house of grim shadows, for murder was committed there. Men entered alive and left it dead. Max stood by the coffin of the man who had so cleverly sought to entice him away to Constantinople with stories of easily obtained wealth, and remained there breathless in wonder. He recollected Sam's words and saw in them a bitter hatred of the Franco-English adventurer. Had he carried this hatred to the extreme limit, that of secret assassination? Charlie, on his part, stood silent also. He knew well that upon the death of Adam depended the future prosperity of his master. He was well aware, alas, that Adam, having suddenly reappeared, had vowed a terrible and crushing vengeance upon the head of the great firm of Statham Brothers. But old Sam, with his usual crafty forethought and innate cunning, had forestalled him. The adventurer had been done to death and was already in his coffin. In his cool audacity, old Sam had actually prepared the lead-lined coffin with its plate ready inscribed. Its secret arrival at night had evidently been witnessed and had given rise to strange and embellished stories. The last occasion Max had seen Adam was one night 3 weeks before, when, dining with two other men in the gallery of the Trocadero restaurant, he had seen him below seated with a rather young and good-looking lady in an evening dress of black net. The pair were laughing together, and it struck him that the companion of the adventurer might be French. He had afterwards discovered that she was Lorena Lyle, daughter of the old hunchback engineer who was his partner in certain ventures. "The girl who met me in Paris and gave me warning," Rolf exclaimed. "Yes, the same. They dined together that night and hurried out to get to the theatre." "And you have never seen him since?" "No. 10 days ago I wrote to the National Liberal Club giving him an appointment, but he never kept it." "Because he was lying here, I suppose," remarked Charlie with bated breath, adding, "This, Max, is all utterly incomprehensible. How dare the old man do such a thing? He has been driven into a corner, and as long as he preserves his secret, he will still remain a power in the land. But his secret is out. We have laid it bare." "At risk of our lives, eh?" remarked Max, shuddering again as he recollected his own narrow escape of a few minutes before. They stood before the mortal remains of the man who had sworn vengeance upon Statham, neither of them speaking. Presently, however, Charlie proposed that they should make further investigation on the floor above. Closing the door of the death chamber, they stole noiselessly up the wide, thickly carpeted staircase to the next landing, where 4 wide doors opened. Which they should enter first, they were undecided. They were faced by a serious problem. In either of those 4 chambers, the old millionaire might be asleep. To enter might awaken him. This they had no desire to do. They expected to be able to open the iron door from within and pass down the stairs into the hall and so into the street without detection. That was their intention. To return by the way they had come would be impossible. Together they consulted in low whispers, and both agreed. Charlie very carefully turned the handle of the door nearest them. It yielded, and they crept forward and within. At first Max feared to show his light. Yet as they found no carpet beneath their feet, and as they felt a vague sense of space in the darkness, he became bolder and pressed the button of his little lamp. It was like the other apartments, entirely devoid of furniture. The upper part of those premises, believed by the world to be filled with costly furniture and magnificent antiques, seemed empty. Charlie was amazed. He had heard many romantic stories of why the old man never allowed a stranger to ascend the stairs, but he had never dreamed that the fine mansion was unfurnished. The next room they examined was similar in character, rather larger, with two long windows overlooking the park. They were, however, carefully curtained, and the blinds were down. Beyond a rusty old fender before the fireplace and a roll of old carpet in a corner, it, however, containing nothing. They passed to the third apartment, likewise a front room, and Max slowly turned the door handle. In the darkness they stepped within, and again finding it uncarpeted, he shone his light across the place. Next instant the pair drew back, for sitting up upon a low iron camp bedstead, glaring at them with eyes haggard and terrified, was old Sam Statham himself. The room was bare, save an old painted washstand and chest of drawers, dirty, uncarpeted, and neglected. The low, narrow bed was covered by an old blue and white counterpane, but its occupant sat glaring at the intruders, too terrified to speak. In the darkness he probably could not recognize who it was. The electric light blinded him. Next second, however, he touched the switch near his hand, and the wretched room became illuminated, revealing the two intruders. He tried to speak, but his lips refused to articulate. The old man's tongue clave to the roof of his mouth. He knew that his carefully guarded secret was out. The end of chapter 50. Chapter 51 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Queux. Chapter 51 describes another surprise. To what, pray, do I owe this intrusion? Demanded the old man fiercely, rising from his bed and standing erect and defiant before them. To your own guilt, Mr. Statham, was Max Barclay's quiet but distinct response. My guilt? Gasped the old man. Of what crime am I guilty? That's best known to yourself, answered the younger man. But I think, now that we have investigated your house and discovered your death trap, we will bid you good night. You have found it, eh? Gasped the old fellow, pale as death. Yes, and furthermore, we know how Maud Petrovich had cast your money at your feet and defied you. I must explain, he cried, as in frantic eagerness he put on his clothes. Don't leave me. Come below, and I'll tell you. The pair remained in the wretchedly uncomfortable room while the old man finished dressing. Then all three descended, the millionaire walking first. They passed the door of the room where stood the coffin, and by touching a spring, the iron door opened, and they descended to the library. The noise wakened old Levy, who appeared at the head of the back stairs, full of surprise. A reassuring word from his master, however, caused him to at once retire again. Within the library, old Sam switched on the light and invited both his unwelcome visitors to be seated. Then, standing before them, he said, I presume, gentlemen, that your curiosity led you to break into my house? Max Barclay nodded. I can understand you acting thus, sir, but I cannot understand Rolf, who knows me so well and who has served me so faithfully. And in return, how have I been served? Asked Charlie bitterly. My poor sister has been turned adrift, and you have refused to lift a finger to reinstate her. I admit that on the face of it, Rolf, I have been hard and cruel, declared the old man. But when you know the truth, you will not perhaps think so unkindly of me as at this moment. The old fellow was perfectly calm. All his fear had vanished, and he now stood his old and usual self, full of quiet assurance. Well, Rolf said, perhaps you will tell us the truth. Why, for instance, did Maud Petrovich visit you tonight? She came upon her own initiative. She wished to ask me a question, which you refused to answer. It was not judicious for me to tell her what she desired to know, not at present at least. But now that we are here together, in confidence, you will, no doubt, allow us to know where she and her father are in hiding, Charlie asked breathlessly. Certainly, if you will promise not to communicate with them or call upon them without my consent. We promise, declared Max. Then they are living in strictest seclusion at Fordham Cottage, Arundel in Sussex. But you have quarrelled with Maud, Charlie remarked, at the same time remembering that closed coffin in the room above. Upon one point only. "A very small and unimportant one," responded the old man. "Where is my sister?" "Unfortunately, I have no knowledge of where she is at present." "But you have just assured me that when I know the truth I shall not regard you so harshly," Rolf exclaimed. "And I repeat it," Statham said. The old man's attitude amazed them both. He was perfectly calm and quite unperturbed by the grim discoveries they had made. "You mean that you refuse to tell me anything concerning my sister?" Charlie asked seriously. "For the present, yes." "Why not now? Why forbid us also from seeking the doctor and his daughter?" "For a reason of my own. I am expecting a visitor." Max laughed sarcastically. The reason put forward seemed too absurd. "Ah, you don't believe it," cried the old fellow. "But you'll see. Your curiosity has no doubt led you to misjudge me. It was only to have been expected. I ought to have guarded my secret better." Neither man spoke. Both had their eyes fixed upon the grey face of the old millionaire before them. They recollected his despair before he had retired to rest, and remembered too the tender care of his faithful Levy. The clock chimed the half hour, 3:30 in the morning. The night had been fraught by so many surprises that neither Charlie nor his friend could believe in the grim reality of it all. They never suspected that that fine mansion was practically unfurnished, or that its millionaire owner practically lived the life of a pauper. Had not Charlie been well aware of his master's shrewdness in his business and cleverness in his financial operations, he would have believed it all due to an unbalanced brain. But there was no madness in Samuel Statham. He was as sane as they were. All his eccentricity was evidently directed towards one purpose. As he stood there, he practically told them so. "You misjudged me," said he, his grey face relaxing in a smile. "You think me mad, eh? Well, you are not alone in that. A good many people believe the same of me. I am gratified to think they believe it. It's my intention that they should. But, Mr. Statham, we have asked you a question to which you have refused to answer. We wish to know what has become of Marian Rolfe." "You are engaged to her, eh?" "Yes, I know," responded the old man. "For that very reason I refuse to tell you. I can only reassure you, however, that you need experience no anxiety." "But I do. I love her." "Then I am very sorry. Your mind must still continue to be exercised. At present I cannot tell you anything." "Why?" "Have I not already told you? I am expecting a visitor." It was all the satisfaction they could obtain. Charlie longed for an opportunity to refer to the gruesome object in that locked room upstairs. The man who had so suddenly reappeared and sworn vengeance upon the great financier was dead, fallen a victim, no doubt, to the old man's clever cunning. He had, without doubt, been enticed there to his death. The secret reason of the white enamelled door at the top of the stairs was now quite plain. In that house was a terrible death trap, as deadly as it was unexpected. They held knowledge of the truth. How would the old man act? Contrary to their expectations, he remained quite indifferent. He even offered them a drink, which they refused. His refusal to tell them anything regarding Marian and his treatment of Maud had incensed them, and they both were bitterly antagonistic towards him. He was no doubt playing a huge game of bluff. His disregard of their discoveries was in order to lessen their importance, and his story of a visitor told to gain time. Probably he intended to make good his escape. Both were expecting every moment that this coolness would break down, and that he would suggest that they keep silence as to what lay concealed on the floor above. Indeed, they were not mistaken, for of a sudden he turned to them and in rather strained voice said, "Now, gentlemen, I admit that you have discovered my secret, that my position is, well, a disagreeable one, to say the least. Is there any real reason why you should divulge it, at least for the present?" Charlie shrugged his shoulders, and Max at the same time realized that a deadly fear was creeping back upon the old man, whose enormous wealth had stifled all human feeling from his soul. "I merely ask your indulgence," said the old man in a low, eager tone. "For how long?" "For a day, maybe for a week, or perhaps a month. I cannot tell." "That means that we preserve the secret indefinitely?" "Until the arrival of my visitor." "Ah, the visitor," repeated Max with a grin of disbelief. "When do you expect the visit?" "I have expected it during many months," was the millionaire's brief reply. "And you can tell us nothing more?" Is not your story a somewhat lame one? Very, I quite admit it, but I can only assure you of its truth. It is not often you speak the truth, Mr. Statham, is it? Asked Max pointedly. I suppose I am like many other men, was his reply. I only speak it when obliged. As he uttered those words, there sounded in the hall the loud electric bell of the front door. It was rung twice, whereupon old Sam drew himself up in an instant in an attitude of alertness. The visitor, he gasped, raising his bony finger. The long-expected caller. The 2 rings were evidently a prearranged signal. They heard old Levy shuffling outside. The door opened, and he stood expectant, looking at his master, but uttering no word. Gentlemen, exclaimed old Sam, if you will permit me, I'll go and receive my visitor. May I ask you to remain here until I return to you? Return to answer your inquiries you may be pleased to put to me? The old fellow was quite calm again. He seemed to have braced himself up to meet his visitor, whoever he or she might be. It was one of his secret agents, Charlie thought, without a doubt. Both men consented, and old Sam withdrew with Levy. Please remain here. I ask you both to respect my wishes, he said, and going out closed the door behind him. The 2 men listened with strained ears. They heard the sound of footsteps outside, but as far as they could distinguish, no word was spoken. Whether the mysterious visitor was male or female, they could not ascertain. For several moments they stood at the door listening. Then Max, unable to resist his own curiosity, opened the door slightly and peered into the hall. But only Levy was there, his back turned towards the door. His master and his visitor had ascended the stairs together, passing the iron door which now stood open for the first time. Max beckoned Charlie, who, looking outside into the hall, saw Levy standing with both hands pressed to his brow in an attitude of wildest despair. His agitation was evidently for his master's safety. A visitor at 3:45 in the morning was unusual, to say the least. Who could it be? Levy turned, and as he did so, Max closed the door noiselessly, for he did not wish the faithful old servant to discover him as an eavesdropper. Fully 10 minutes elapsed, when of a sudden the sharp crack of a pistol shot echoed through the empty upstairs rooms. It caused both men to start, so unexpected was it. For a second they hesitated. Then, opening the door, they both dashed up the forbidden stair. The end of chapter 51. Chapter 52 of The Pauper of Park Lane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux. Chapter 52 contains a complete revelation. A complete surprise awaited them. The door of the small room on the first floor stood open, and within the light was switched on. Upon the threshold they both paused, dumbfounded by the scene before them. Just as they had left it, the coffin stood upon its trestles, but lying on the floor beside was the body of the man whose name it bore upon its plate. The man Gene Adam. In his nerveless grasp was a big service revolver, while the small round hole in his white temple told its own tale, a tale of sudden denunciation and of suicide. The dead man wore evening dress. On his white shirt front was an ugly crimson splash, while his fast glazing eyes, still open, stared blankly into space. At the opposite wall, leaning against it for support, was old Sam Statham, his countenance blanched, his jaws set, unable to utter a word. The sudden unexpectedness of the tragedy had appalled him. He stood speechless. He could only point to the inanimate form upon the floor. Max lifted the body and sought eagerly for signs of life. There were, however, none. The bullet had penetrated his brain, causing instant death. Sam Statham's enemy, the man whom they had presumed was already in his coffin, was dead. Yet what was the meaning of it all? The whole affair was a complete enigma. Why had Gene Adam, the adventurer who had lived by his wits for years and the hero of 1,000 thrilling adventures, taken his own life beside his own coffin? Rolf and Barclay turned away from the gruesome scene and in silence descended the stairs, where, standing back in the shadow, trembling like an aspen, stood old Levy. As they passed down, the servant entered the room to join his master with whispered words of awe. Then, at the millionaire's suggestion, when he descended to them 5 minutes later, Charlie went forth into Park Lane and, walking hastily towards the fountain, found a constable whom he informed of the tragedy. As he went back to the house with the policeman at his side, he wondered whether, after all, he had not misjudged old Sam. In any case, there was a great and complete mystery which must now be elucidated. Just outside the little town of Arundel in rural Sussex, at the top of the steep hill which leads on to the high road to Chichester, a road rendered dusty in summer and muddy in winter by the constant succession of motor cars which tear along it, stands Fordham Cottage, a small unpretentious red brick house surrounded by a pretty garden and divided from the road by a high old wall clothed completely by ivy. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Within the neat old-fashioned front parlour, for the owners of the house, where two prim maiden ladies, stood Rolf and Barclay, together with a grey-haired, grey-bearded man who, having rented the place furnished, was living there in complete seclusion, Dr. Michael Petrovich. They were in earnest conversation, but Charlie kept his eyes upon the window as though in expectation of the arrival of someone. The autumn day was fine and dry, and Maud, returning from London by the first train, which had arrived at 6:30 that morning, had, after luncheon, gone out upon her cycle, as was her daily habit. Her lover, anxious and impatient, scarcely heeded what the doctor was explaining to Max. For the past hour, both men had been describing in brief what had occurred since the ex-minister's disappearance from Cromwell Road, relating practically what was already been chronicled in the preceding chapters. They had told him of Adam's threats, of the warning given to Charlie by Lorena Lyle, of Adam's endeavour to entice Max to Constantinople, and of Statham's evident terror of Adam's vengeance. To it all the grave, grey-bearded statesman had listened attentively. Only when they described their secret visit to the house in Park Lane and the extraordinary discoveries they had made there did their hearer evince surprise. Then, knitting his brows, he nodded as though he understood. And when they told him of Adam's suicide, he drew a deep breath of apparent relief. "That man," he said in a low, distinct voice, with scarce a trace of accent, "that man was my enemy as well as Statham's. It was he who, in order to further his speculative financial schemes, paid an assassin to throw a bomb at my carriage, the bomb that killed the poor little child. He was an adventurer who had filched money from widows and orphans, a scoundrel and an assassin. The assassin, when in the fortress at Belgrade, confessed to the identity of his employer, but in the meantime he disappeared. To South America, it is believed. Prior to the attempt upon me, Lyle, the mining engineer, was his cat's paw, as he has ever since been, a good fellow at heart, but weak and at the same time adventurous. Once or twice they made big profits out of concessions for copper mining obtained from my predecessor in office. When Adam found that I refused to participate in business that was a fraud upon the public in Paris and London, he plotted to get rid of me. Fortunately, he did not succeed. But when the truth was exposed to the Serbian government, that he was a real assassin, certain valuable concessions were at once withdrawn from him, and he was thereby ruined. He vowed vengeance upon me, and also upon Statham, to whom the concessions had been transferred, a terrible vengeance. But soon afterwards he disappeared, and we heard upon what seemed to be good authority that he was dead. He had been shot in a drunken brawl in Caracas. And then he suddenly turned up again, eh? Max remarked. Yes, and for that reason Mr. Statham suggested that I and my daughter Maud should disappear to some place to which he could not trace us. Statham defied his threats, but at the same time thought that if we disappeared in such a manner that the police would not seek us, it would be a wise step. For that reason I arranged that the furniture as well as ourselves should disappear, in order to make it appear that we had suddenly removed, and also to prevent the police searching too inquisitively for missing persons. Had they done this, our hiding place would soon have been discovered. I disappeared more for Maud's sake than for my own. I knew the desperate character of the man, and the mad vengeance within his villainous heart. But Statham also feared him, remarked Charlie, recollecting the occasion when his employer had betrayed such terror. Yes, the exact facts I do not know. He will tell you himself, answered the ex-minister. Maud was in London last night and called upon Statham, Max remarked. She called in secret lest she might be seen and followed by Adam, her father replied. She went there to return to Statham a sum of money he had sent her. For what? He wished to know the whereabouts of Lorena Lyle, who had been a schoolfellow in Belgrade. Statham, I fear, intended in some way to avenge himself upon Lyle, and on his daughter more especially, on account of his association with his enemy. The girl is in London, and he wished to know where she was living. and the money which she returned was given her in order to induce her to divulge?" The doctor nodded in the affirmative, adding, "You see that Statham, surrounded by unscrupulous enemies as he has been, was bound to act always for his own protection. He has been misjudged by you, by everybody. I, who know him more intimately perhaps than anyone save his own brother Levi, assure you that it is so." "His brother Levi?" cried Charlie. "Of course, Levi, who poses as his servant, is his brother. They have been inseparable always, from the early days when Sam Statham was a mining prospector and concession hunter, the days before fortune smiled upon the three Statham brothers, and they were able to open the doors of the offices in Old Broad Street. The romance of old Sam's life is a romance of the great firm." "He treated my sister badly," declared Charlie. "For that I can never forgive him." "No, there you're wrong. It is true that he would not allow her to be reinstated at Cunnington's, and on the face of it treated her unjustly. But he had a motive." True, she refused to betray to him something which my daughter had told her in confidence. For that refusal he allowed her to be dismissed from her situation. But on the following day he sent her down to me here to remain in concealment. Why? Because of that man Adam. He had been attracted by her good looks, and had begun to pester her with his attentions. Statham knew this from the report of one who had watched her in secret. Therefore, by sending her here into hiding, he was acting in her best interests. "Then she is here?" cried Max anxiously, his face suddenly brightening. "Yes. See, here she comes, with Maud." And as both men turned quickly to the window, they saw the two laughing girls, flushed by their ride, wheeling their cycles up the path from the road. Next moment both men dashed outside, and both girls, utterly amazed and breathless, found themselves suddenly in the arms of their lovers. The doctor looked on, smiling and in silence. He saw the lips of both girls covered with the hot, fervent kisses of good and honest men. He heard their whispered words, and then he turned away. Those long black days of suspicion and despair were at an end. The mystery of it all was now being rapidly solved, and both girls within that little parlour wept tears of joy upon the shoulders of the men whom they had chosen as their husbands. The happiness of 4 young hearts was complete. The grim shadow had lifted, and upon them now fell at last the bright sunshine of life and of love. The self-effacement of that little household was at an end. Freed from the bondage of silence, the truth was at last told. Maud, with her own lips, explained to Charlie the confession she had made to Marianne on the night of their disappearance. She had told her how the man Adam, whom she had known in Belgrade, had followed her several times in the neighbourhood of Earl's Court, had spoken to her, and had declared his love for her. She never suspected that he had been her father's enemy, the man who had been the instigator of the dastardly outrage, until on the previous evening her father had, in confidence, told her the truth, and added that, because of his reappearance, they had to fly. She dared not tell him that they had met, but she had made Marianne her confidant. It was the story of the bomb outrage that had held Marianne horrified. Charlie, when he had listened open-mouthed to the explanation of his well-beloved, cried, "The assassin! And he dared to speak to you of love!" "He is dead, dearest," answered the girl, quietly stroking his hair from his brow. "Let us forgive him, and forget." For answer, he took her again in his arms and kissed her tenderly upon the lips. 3 days later. The coroner's jury had returned a verdict of suicide while of unsound mind, and the body of Jean Adam had, with the undertaker's assistance, been buried in Highgate Cemetery in the actual coffin which had been so long prepared for him. It was surely a weird revenge of old Sam's. But the whole occurrence was a grim and terrible repayment of an old debt. In the fading twilight of the wet and gloomy day on which the dead man's body was, without a single follower, committed to the grave, Rolfe and Barclay were seated with the millionaire in the familiar library in Park Lane. Old Sam had been making explanations similar to those made by the doctor down at Arundel. Suddenly he said, looking from one to the other, "And now I have to apologize to you both. In arranging the disappearance of my dear friend the doctor, I contrived to mislead you in order to add mystery to the occurrence. I knew, Rolfe, you lost your train at Charing Cross that night, and that you did not wish to be seen off by your sister Marian, because you had, in my interest, quarrelled with Adam, and had made murderous threats against him, perhaps unwisely. These threats, however, you believed Adam had told to Barclay. Hence your fear of the last named later on. I arranged that a man should be present at Cromwell Road in clothes resembling your own, that a garment should be placed in the house with a blood stain upon it, and that the doctor's safe should be blown open as though thieves had visited the place after the removal of the furniture. I knew from the doctor that you, Barclay, would go there that evening, and my object was to puzzle and mislead you, at the same time believing that, having suspicions of your friend Rolf, you would not go to the police. Again, in order to test Rolf's devotion to myself, I suggested that the honor of the woman he loved, if sacrificed, could save me. I made the suggestion in order to put Rolf off the scent. Then it was all your doing, Max cried in surprise. Entirely, was the old man's response, in the interests of myself as well as of both of you. Adam believed that you were aware of his secret intentions. Therefore, he was plotting to entice you to Turkey, a country where you might have disappeared with ease. That was undoubtedly his object. For a few moments he paused. Then, clearing his throat, the old man said, in a distinct voice, "The other night you were no doubt both surprised to find my drawing-room transposed into the interior of a Russian house. Well, it was done with a distinct purpose, to defeat my enemy. He, with his friend and accomplice Lyle, had made a false charge against me, a charge supported by the perjured evidence of the hunchback, a charge of having in the old days, years ago, murdered a woman, the woman who was my wife." A shadow of pain crossed the old man's brow, as that seemed a bitter remembrance. Then, after a moment's pause, he went on. "She was worthless. Ah, yes, I admit that. But I swear I am innocent of the charge they brought against me. She was killed in Caracas in a brutal manner, but by whom I could never discover. After her death, I left South America. Adam and his friend dropped their foul charge against me, and I lost sight of them for years. Later on, I was prospecting in the Timon Mountains in northern Russia within the Arctic Circle, a wild snow-covered country outside the edge of civilization. Both gold and emeralds had been discovered along the Ishma Valley, and there had been a rush there. Among the many adventurous spirits attracted thither was Gene Adam and his attendant alter ego, Lyle. We met again. It was in winter, and we were in a state of semi-starvation, all three of us. Not a word was said regarding the charge they had made against me. Both were without means, and both down on their luck. For a fortnight we remained together, then, finding things hopeless, resolved to struggle back to civilization at the nearest little Russian village, a miserable little place called Ust-Usa, 450 versts south. On the way, we all three nearly succumbed to the intense cold and want of food. At last, however, late one night, we came across a lonely house in a clearing in the pine forest on the outskirts of the village, which was our goal. Sinking with fatigue, we begged shelter of the white-bearded man who lived there. He took us in, gave us food, and allowed us to sleep. I was drowsy and slept heavily. It was late when I awoke. When I awoke, I find lying beside the table opposite me the old man stone dead, stabbed to the heart. The place had been ransacked. The old man's hoard of money, for there are no banks there, had been found, and my two companions were missing. They had gone no one knew whither. What could I do? To remain would mean to be accused of the crime, and probably sent to Siberia. Well, I reflected for a moment. Then I took some food, stole out, and made my way again into the snow-covered wilderness. Ah, the recollection of it all is still upon me, though years have since elapsed. "And then?" asked Max, when he found tongue. "Since then, I and my brothers, Levi and Ben, have abandoned the old life, but have ever since been determined to avenge the brutal murder of that poor old peasant. I made a vow not to enjoy the luxuries which my money brought me until my conscience had been cleared and the assassin brought to justice. Hence I have lived in the desolation attendant upon pauperism. I have been the pauper of Park Lane. 7 years ago I sent an agent to the place and purchased all the interior of the house. Then when I came to live here, I had the drawing-room fitted as you see it, and have since awaited my opportunity. The other night, as you know, Gene Adam came to renew his false charge against me, and I took him upstairs and ushered him suddenly into the scene of his crime. Ah, his terror was horrible to witness. He trembled from head to foot. He saw the hangman's rope around his neck. Then I took him into the next room and showed him in silence what I had prepared for him. He read his own name inscribed there, and with a curse upon his lips drew his revolver and put an end to his life. Both his hearers remained in silence. It had surely been a just vengeance, blood for blood. A year has now passed. Marianne is now the wife of Max Barclay, and the pair spend the greater part of their time at the beautiful old castle Kilmarnock up in Perthshire, for in a perfect happiness she prefers a healthy outdoor life to that of London. Rolf, who is still confidential secretary to Mr. Samuel Statham, has married Maud and has abandoned his bachelor chambers in Jermyn Street for a pretty little house in Curzon Street, where he is quite near to the mansion in Park Lane. Dr. Petrovich has returned to Serbia at the invitation of the king and is expected every day to accept the portfolio of Prime Minister. Old Duncan MacGregor has been promoted to be general manager of the great Clyden Motherwell locomotive works, while Levy acts as servant to his brother, their secret still being kept, and the position of Statham brothers in the city is today higher than it has ever been. As regards the Park Lane mansion with the red-striped sun-blinds, the house you know well, without doubt. There is now no further mystery concerning it. The rumours regarding its beautiful interior and the sounds of piano playing were all, of course, the outcome of gossip. The truth, however, is now common knowledge, and society during the past 9 months or so has been amazed to see painters, decorators, and upholsterers so busily at work. It is evident that old Sam Statham intends to entertain largely during his coming season. The house is now exquisitely furnished from top to bottom. He no longer sleeps on his little camp bed or dines off a chump chop cooked over a gas stove by old Levy. The dark shadow has now been lifted from his life. In fact, he no longer lives in the squalor of an empty house as the pauper of Park Lane. The end of chapter 52. The end of The Pauper of Park Lane by William Le Queux.